Okay, well, I think we need to move on. So
you.
thank you very much, Ellen, for
Thanks,
that.
Steve.
Fascinating
I start
talk. So let's
sharing.
move to our next speakers, Chia-ju Zhang and Kurt Spellmeyer of Brooklyn College and Rutgers, respectively. Yogacara, compulsive behavior and life-sustaining creativity. So Kurt and Chia-ju, please take it away.
Okay, thank you so much. Just a little backstory, or a couple of backstories before I get to the main. We get to the main presentation. First of all, you might say, why Yogacara? Why Shishong? Why does that matter? But this is really it's not maybe widely understood in the United States, but the Buddhism that went into Tibet was primarily Madhyamaka. But the Buddhism in China and virtually every school is deeply indebted to Yogacara thinking. So if you look at somebody like the great Chang, 19th and 20th century master Xu Yun, right? He's constantly referencing elements of Yogacara thinking in his Dharma discourses. And Taishu understood that this is like really crucial to Chinese Buddhism. So this is like the cornerstone of Chinese Buddhism. It's not arcane or irrelevant. And I wanted to explain the rationale for the subject of the talk itself, but also, Jaru and I have been thinking a lot about the history of deep ecology and how that unfolded. What happened in the United States in the 1960s was the publication of Silent Spring. And this was a major event because it was eye-opening to millions of readers of that book. The book ultimately had a huge readership, that we were overtaxing our environment and that we were headed for a serious breakdown in the environmental system. And that was news to most Americans. And of course, as you know, that was debated in the newspaper. She was attacked. But that event coincides with another event, which is the arrival of the Dharma in the United States. So at the very same time, you have people like Alan Watts, whose books published around the same time, was very popular, D.T. Suzuki, Lu Kuan-yu, representing Chinese Buddhism. And these two cultural vectors intersected in deep ecology. People like Arne Naess, and eventually Gary Snyder, who was an important spokesman for this kind of synthesis of these two elements of American culture in the 1960s. And this created like an explosion of thinking that ramified around the world. But there was a reaction to this, and it's a complex reaction. There was a book by a historian named William Cronin, who you may not have heard of, but his book was called On Common Ground. And that was really the first salvo, the first attack against deep ecological thinking. And in a way, I don't think it was their intention, but it was also an attempt to disentangle American culture from its love affair with East Asian thinking about the natural world. And it's an anthology rather than a single author collection, but it sort of very carefully dismantles its representation of deep ecology. And actually it was a misrepresentation, but it was very effective. And ecological thinking, what you could call eco-criticism, goes off in a different direction. You have a period where ecological thinking is caught up in sort of post-structuralism, the idea that nature doesn't really exist, it's just a cultural construction. And then after that, you have something called like neo-materialism, which is people like, I guess you could say Timothy Morton or Jane Bennett, who are carrying on this tradition. So Jaru and I feel that this was a historical tragedy in some ways and a real missed opportunity for the West. Because at this moment, the defenders of deep ecology or East Asian thinking about the natural world and the whole tradition of Lao Tzu and Buddhist thinking about nature wasn't really able to defend itself very ably against these attacks because the scholarship hadn't caught up. It wasn't really until the 1980s that you began to get serious scholarly attention to Yogacara thinking in the structure of East Asian Buddhism, and partly to blame also, as Jaru knows very well, was that the Republican period was embarrassed by Chang. It was embarrassed by Zen, and it thought that Zen was irrational and unmodern. And so it turned to Yogacara as a way of thinking, as a scientific view of the mind. And this is actually like a deep misunderstanding of Yogacara's role in Chinese culture, but it was also sort of like another cul-de-sac. So now we're in a position, I think, as scholars, to go back and we would say we're in a position now to go back and look at Yogacara and look and defend East Asian ways of thinking about nature. And so that's what our paper is really all about. I do want to observe the time, but I do want to observe the time, so I'll be very careful to stop. You know, I think everybody would admit that we're failing to respond to the environmental crisis. As you know, so far humankind's response has been characterized primarily by delay, denial, and distortion. And what makes the situation remarkable is the contradiction between the inertia of our institutions and the abundance of research and press coverage pointing to potential disaster. You know, we can attribute some of our unresponsiveness to market forces, but even the elite are going to go down if the natural environment goes down. So when that can't fully explain the problem. When we return to the problem itself, the disjunction between what we know and what we do or don't do, we can recognize the classic symptomatology of compulsive behavior. And this would suggest that attempts to convey science-based information more effectively are unlikely to meet with success. And this is exactly where we are now. And we would argue that we should consider approaches that draw from psychoanalytic tradition, but those centered on classical Freudian models probably perpetuate the disconnect between humans and the natural world by strengthening the demarcations between an objective world and a subjective self. And Lacanian psychotherapy, in our view, does a little better by locating the problem not in individual psychology, but in a symbolic order that has to be changed. But Lacanian therapeutics don't really provide tools required to change the symbolic order. And we're quite convinced that a significant contribution can be made by Buddhist Weishishong psychology, which offers a new for the West model of the mind and a therapeutics designed to bring compulsive compulsions to consciousness and allow them to be repurposed in new ways. So that's the plan, and we think we can make a good case, not in 15 minutes, but let me say something about Yogacara. Okay, so although Yogacara is often misunderstood as Buddhist idealism, many scholars in the West have argued more recently that its adherence to the tenet mind only citta matra, or consciousness only vijnati matra, does not mean that no real world exists, but that the world is accessible to us only in the form of constructions or representations arising from a complex confluence of forces. These forces include what we today would call our biology through the five senses and the physiology that supports their operation, our consciousness, which is mono consciousness, and the operations of the unconscious, manas consciousness and alaya consciousness. It's important to appreciate that our sensory lives, our consciousness, and our unconscious all have histories that include not only the collective past, but our communities and of humankind in general, but also our individual biographies. The karma of humankind, so to speak, shapes, directs, and constrains everyday realities that we share with others as culture, while our individual karma also structures our moment-by-moment awareness in ways that are often uniquely our own. Finally, both a personal and cultural unconscious are always at work. And one function of meditative practice is to uncover the influence of these unconscious forces and advance us further on the path to awakening by reconstructing our vasana, energy habits, or cognitive patterns in more enabling ways. Although the world accessible to us will always be a cultural or cognitive artifice. What we experience is not necessarily unreal, but limited, and because of karma, arbitrary and frequently disabling, especially when we have developed these compulsive behaviors. These compulsive behaviors often arise in order to protect us from an unconscious recognition that our projections are at variance with our current reality. So if we had time, we could say a lot more about what a robust and sophisticated understanding of the unconscious Yogacara thinking provides us. It has strengths relative to its Western counterparts. It has a cultural dimension, has a historical dimension, and so on. And we feel that this would be hugely advantageous as we're trying to deal with these collective social pathologies. Conventional Western psychotherapy often uses a process of dialogue, like talk therapy, to encourage us to abandon our past self-image in favor of better ones suited to our current circumstances. But Yogacara psychology, which underlies practices central to Chang, Mahamudra, and the Nyingma traditions in Tibet, aims to reveal the illusory or constructed nature of our self-image, and also the illusory projections on the external world that support this self-image. Once the illusion of an autonomous self is deconstructed, our existence can be experienced as arising spontaneously within a larger system where nothing has an independent existence or own being, as Buddhism calls it, but emerges only in concert with everything else. That's dependent origination. Right? Just as projections might be understood as a form of clinging to a past construction that no longer remains viable, so they can also be a tendency to project pre-existing conceptual and dualistic schemas onto sensory or mental objects. Such a dualistic mental projection of things further solidifies our experience of alienation. So the upshot of this is that we think this addresses, it's not just a robust theory of the mind, and in many ways more advantageous than its Western counterparts, but we feel it might be just the medicine that we in the United States need. And in our paper, one of the things we do is to look at an article from the recent article from the Los Angeles Times, and in order to respect the boundary of our talk, I won't go into too much detail, but the article is really striking because it's about the fact that the Florida Keys are going to be inundated. Even the least worst case scenario suggests that something like 40% of the Keys will be inundated within our hopefully within our lifetimes, right? And the article deals with the way this particular community is dealing with the crisis. And the plan is a textbook case of our social pathology. Basically, what the mayor and the civic officials have decided to do is, because it's flooding, they're going to raise the roadway, right? They're going to spend like $50 billion to raise the roadway, and then everybody has to take care of their own house, right? So we're not going to come up with a common solution that will benefit everyone equally. We're going to protect the residual shared infrastructure, and then everybody's on his or her own, right? So this is sort of symptomatic of contemporary American culture. And the solution is, or the problem is, that people are unable, and we would say culturally and psychologically unable to imagine a collective response to this problem. And we see this replicated all over the United States. So although the actual crisis could be years away, several decades if we're likely, the psychological crisis has already begun, as demonstrated by the political success of climate denialism. And because denialism can provide tens of millions of Americans with permission to repress the likelihood of catastrophe, Attempts at rational persuasion using evidence will leave untouched the structures of identity that get reinforced at every turn in the culture at large, in the schools, in the economy, and even in the so-called democracy based on one person, one vote. But if persuasion won't change things, then culture workers need to explore other ways of transforming how and what people think. And here the Yogacara understanding of the mind has a crucial role to play. Yogacara psychology would suggest that we need to identify seeds or widely circulating memes that can destabilize and reconstellate the existing organization of consciousness. Ideally, attention to these special memes would bring to consciousness contradictions that cannot be resolved without a psycholinguistic transformation like the Gestalt switch in Western psychology. Inspired by Yogacara, the Chan tradition often uses phrase length or sentence length memes known as gungan. So famous is what is the sound of one hand clapping? But single words or ideas, wato, can have this transformative effect as well if they are multivalent or indeterminate in their signification, like the word wu, emptiness, or hu, shui. But the meme most likely to destabilize the current architecture of the mind, our collective psychology, is, we think, the trope of nature, which we're well aware the eco-critical community long ago rejected as an empty signifier. But this emptiness is precisely what makes it potentially so liberating. It's surprising and significant in this regard that just recently, Florida legislators, even Republicans, have approved a comprehensive plan for restoring an area near the Keys, the Everglades, to a state much closer to its natural condition. Although the legislators wouldn't put it this way, they did so in part because nature unconsciously signifies a reality beyond or outside the competitive individualism at the heart of American culture. Nature actually has no meaning other than not human. And so when legislators pledge to dismantle a century of engineering, they're actually acknowledging their inability to control the situation. It's a little like wu wei, wu wei. A Yogacara reading of their response would conclude that a process of reconstellation is already underway in our culture, even if none of those involved are consciously aware of it. Yogacara psychology would suggest, in fact, that the idea of nature or wild nature is our best hope for undoing the conscious and unconscious structures of mind that have pushed us to the edge of disaster. By contrast, all programs for technological mitigation or amelioration are bound to fail. First, because in the United States, competing individual interests will prevent us from ever reaching a consensus. And secondly, because technological solutions will simply reanimate the same compulsive behaviors that have allowed us to ignore the crisis thus far. The idea of an approaching crisis might force, the idea that an approaching crisis will force us to consensus could be, we would describe as the pragmatic fallacy, and it seriously underestimates the psychological and cultural legacy of extreme individualism. As we have learned from Bruno Latour, our technologies are not simply tools, but actants that have their own agendas, and to a degree that Latour himself never considers, they have their own unconscious. Living as we are at the 11th hour, we might take seriously Yogacara's claim that all of us have access to an active, creative unconscious, which is more intelligent than we are. By dissolving the mental structures currently in place, the empty signifier nature would unleash the creative power of that unconscious. Indeed, Yogacara psychology, I should have put that up earlier. Indeed, Yogacara psychology would suggest that through this empty trope, the unconscious is already speaking. So that's the talk.
Thank you so much. Really food for thought, to say the least. So who would like to comment and or pose a question?
I raised my hand. Did you see that?
Oh, sorry, I didn't see it. No,
Yeah.
my eyes aren't very good. Go ahead,
Yeah.
yeah.
I've been waiting. Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And I have a few questions, probably just to begin with. Could you tell me which particular Yogacara text where you can find substantial discussion of nature as we understand it? As far as I know, their primary concern is not with the nature or human world dichotomy, but rather exploring the very complex structure of a conscious and the transformation, and from the psychological perspective, and come up with a worldview, a view of reality, totally very disfamiliar with what we know. All the tradition, philosophical, whether the Chinese tradition or the Indian tradition. So I do not remember reading anything that substantially discuss nature, and then so I would like to hear your.
Kurt, should I give it a try and then you can try to see whether my answer is adequate or you want to add something?
No, please go ahead. I have a lot to say. But please go ahead.
I actually thought about it, I thought, because Kurt and I did have a conversation about whether nature that we're talking to is the natural world, external world, or 自然. So I'm still thinking about, whether which one, or it encompasses both. But in Yogacara, there's a Sanskrit term called artha. It means 外境, external world. And I think if we think about eco disaster, think about that in that context, that we are actually talking about nature as the external world, as 外境, that would be artha. So this is what I am actually thinking about. I don't know what Kurt, whether you agree or what's your thought?
Yes, I mean, it's a very, you've put your finger on a very complicated issue, and the status of what we would call the natural world. I mean, part of our argument is that we're talking about the efficacy of the term nature in the context of Western culture. Actually, we're trying to rescue the concept of nature from the attack on it as a dreamy romantic fantasy, which we don't feel is justified. So part of the thrust of our argument is that we want to use Yogacara thinking to redeem a Western idea, because it will work in the way that Yogacara thinking suggests it should. But my feeling, and I think Jaro feels the same way, is that there's been a misreading of Yogacara as a kind of denial of the reality principle. And we could go on for a long time about whether that's justified or not. But scholars like Dan Lusthaus say, that's not true. But there's a huge, it's a debate. I admit it's a debate, but the descent into Lanka Sutra is really the key. I would say the key Yogacara Sutra for Chang, right? I mean, Damo brought that sutra with him to China, according to legend. And, it's studied, everybody knows it by heart. And I think Jaru's argument, there's a lot of evidence to support Jaru's argument that later in Chang, you have a huge literature on nature, right? You have all this nature poetry, you have, and people want to point to Lao Tzu as the inspiration for that, but I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's true. So it's a very important issue, and it's one we'll have to deal with for sure.
Well, probably I may have to need to take issue with your description about the Yogacara Buddhism, the notion of a 外境 thing. They are not interested in 外境 versus your inner. It is in the process of the analyzing how the different consciousness, like a filming, and that kind of, in the process, you generate phenomena. So they're interested to understand the nature of phenomena, whether it is the mind or it is the real world, how it can come about. Then they talk about the Jing. The Buddhist concept of the Jing itself, it really dismantle the dichotomy, because the Jing, anything that comes with the Jing is something that reflected through the mind. It's not something that exists independent of the mind. Yeah, I think you're right in saying that. Okay, they are concerning with the issue of 性, 本性. So this is a development of Chinese Yogacara, 成为思论. It is not really, inherent in India. It's a very important part of the constitution of Xuanzang. When you talk about the different kind of 境, 所以独影境, 带之境, the three 境. So they are concerned with what is the nature of the real thing. And
Right.
according to them, so the 本质境 is the kind of your sense perception before you synthesize with, before you have the ability and develop ability to form a kind of intelligence, that kind of intuitive engagement, that is the 本质性. So
Yeah,
I think the Zen Buddhism developed from that, inspired for that, and then they add to the element of the Chinese concern with the nature. Then they really give a kind of a dimension, the kind of physical nature, and then this is the whole idea why in art, not in the tongue, that really only in the tongue that you became in the literary theory, the kind of notion of 意境, 物境, 情境. This is really a Chinese adaptation. If you read the 成为思论, you can, and also, I've been trying to find a teacher, who can help me to translate those things. I find it basically untranslatable in English because they develop the psychophenomenon into practically more than 100 categories. And then they have a special whole set of terms like a 见分, 见分, 相分, and then many level, different level complex. It's a lot more complex than we people think. I think you got to be careful, not to just to generalize about this Buddhist school of thought, so complex. And then without really grasping its essential concern and its basic, grounding conceptions. And then you tie to the social phenomenon and thinking, taking it as a key to solve social problem. That could be, very, you really would not, you would not stand. But the one point is right. This school is so intellectually complicated, so sophisticated. It's been compared with Kant, with Western phenomenologists, in the Chinese history itself. This in the school of thought, that there are few things that really, I wish I could figure out. And how could the people living in the town, Xuanzang, could so have a thorough understanding of this such sophisticated, very, 学院派的 kind of a pedantic philosophy and translate into Chinese, and they develop into major. Then, of course, after the invasion of Anluzan thing and the all translation workshop were destroyed, and then basically they have no people to really to keep it as a vibrant community, so it declined after a few generations, after Guiji and Huizao, etc. But at the end of the Ming, it re-emerged, and even like people like in the late Ming and early Qing, like Wang Fuzi, he wrote the Xiangzhang Luo Shuo. At that time, they developed in a resurgence. The reason is that they find a Wang.
We lost you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And for well, probably I need to cut this short, okay? Because but this is a subject I really love, so I can't talking about it. And because I have so many few colleagues with whom I can share my interest about the Yogacara Buddhism.
Perhaps we could,
But at that time, that really becomes an antidote to the shallow Huang Yangming's Buddhism. And the same thing happened at the early Republican period.
Yes.
At that time, for a different reason. They look at Yogacara Buddhism as a Chinese homegrown science tradition, analytical, science. So that's why, you have another research at the beginning. But okay, this is my advice. I think it is an extremely fascinating school of thought, but I think probably we got to be careful when we try to use it as a kind of easy solution to deeply, social tradition, grounded in a totally different.
So let's give them a chance to respond. Xuanhua, do you guys want to say something?
Dara, did you want to say something?
Yeah, let me say something first, and then you. Okay. And I think that's exactly the point. And at the turn of the 20th century, the 唯识救国, the whole idea of 唯识救国, right? Taixu and starting from Yang Renshan and all those people, and all Nanjing was starting with all those Buddhist schools try to revive Yogacara Buddhism and use it as a social theory. They use a political theory, use it as an education program. And then later, even in Taiwan, that Professor Zheng Yanshi at the Zhengzhi University start to develop sort of Taiwanese version of 唯识心理学, 唯识 psychology. And also, I think a two track, at least I noticed that Xuan Zhang's version, understanding of Yogacara is based on one of the disciples of the Yogacara. I forgot the name, but An Hui seemed there's another Yogacara master. An Hui's understanding of reality, and it's very different from the Chinese one. So it took me a long time to sort this out. Yes, like you said, it's very, very complicated. And also in the West, there's Dan Lu's house actually started to develop the idea of Yogacara phenomenology. So we are actually talking about the Western development and the Tibetan development, and even in China, with different dynasty, with different eras, start to have their own branches. So you're sort of branching out. And I think that the idea of 唯识, 万法唯识, that it's actually fits very well with the psychoanalysis, and also the deconstructionist idea of there's no external other than text. I think the ecological crisis is not really the crisis of nature. It's the crisis of our idea about nature, and that's causing the problem. So we really have to focus more on the way our mind works. Kurt, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think that's wonderfully said. I would just add, look, the house is burning down, and we can argue. Look, I totally respect your criticism of the argument, and you're absolutely right. It's Yogacara thinking is so complicated, but if it's so complicated that in order to deploy it, we have to dot, as we say in English, dot every I and cross every T while the planet is burning down, we'll never do anything. And Yogacara will be a museum piece in the history of ideas instead of taking it out into the world and doing something with it. All thinking is upaya, right? All thinking is just skillful means. This is just to, are there really 8 levels of consciousness? Are there 9 levels of consciousness? These are fictions that we've created to relieve human suffering and create enlightenment, right? To generate awakening. So you're absolutely right. We need to be careful, not make gross errors, but if we don't take it out into the world, it's valueless. So that's the existential dimension of this.
Thanks. We have a couple of other questions. Chunjie, do you want to speak?
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, this is discussion is very interesting. I am interested in your mentioning of Latour. So the, Bruno Latour's unconscious and technical unconsciousness. So how, I mean, yeah, just like generally, I mean, could you elaborate a little bit more in terms of the Yogacara religious views?
Yes, I mean, of course, in his work, he's talking about the agency of, we would say, non-sentient beings, right? I mean, that's his idea. And he talks about this idea of actants, non-sentient actors, and that the fact that they have an influence on us. And I might not have been clear, but I was really saying that these actants also have an unconscious dimension that he doesn't seem to be aware of. So I wasn't saying that he says they have an unconscious, but that he hasn't considered the way in which they have a quote unquote unconscious that they, I would put it another way, circulate in consciousness and in ways that bring their own histories that have effects on our actions and behavior, if that makes any sense. So he doesn't say they have an unconscious. I say they do, you know.
So it's
Thanks.
like your way of connecting Latour to the Yogacara thinking.
Yes, the objects have influence on us. That's true, and I think that he hasn't given adequate attention to the way in which they carry a kind of unconscious with them. They affect us in ways that their makers aren't aware of, and even, you know, Latour doesn't talk about. So maybe it's an idea I need to sharpen up a little bit, but that's where I was going with that.
Thanks. Well,
I'm
Marty,
sorry, Steve, for asking a question, setting up an extended discussion on a topic. I think it's too much time. Probably,
no. Well, let's. We have one more person who wants to talk. Marty, do you want to say something?
Yeah, just briefly, 2 points. First, I just quite apart from the textual basis, which I don't know anything about, I found Kurt's tactics and strategies very compelling. And certainly I'll think more about that. There are other sources in China. Of course, one could look to, there's a civil service examination manual, or it was used as a manual, and that's Zhang Ruyu's Shantang Kao Suo, which I cited yesterday. And at the beginning of his discussion of government, he starts out with a Neo-Confucian idea, which doesn't involve any gods or deity. It's just Tiandi Juxin, which is, this term is used by Zheng de Xiu, as well as I would imagine Duxi is using, I have to check that. But in any case, Tiandi there is the term for natural process, rather than, they prefer that rather than Ziran. And the Xin means the tendency, you know, the direction, the qishu of nature. And so he says, well, you know, basically, if you look at nature and you know, what's it all about? It's about the production of life. And societies are meant to be part of this. And governments are necessary to make use of nature to, you know, to produce life, especially human life, but not only human life. And the people are meant to work with that. Also, government sort of helps organize people in doing that. And from this, just from this basic premise, he derives the distinction between public and private, because he says if the emperor or an official actions work against the production of life, in other words, if it harms people or nature, then they're working for their own selfish interest, for their private interest. Whereas if they're working in the public interest, then this will promote a healthy Tiandi, right? Healthy natural process, healthy society, and so on. So you have right there a very basic eco concept, which really lies at the very foundation of the whole political theory that he lays out. It's not his own theory. It's basically a Neo-Confucian theory, but it's one which situates society very firmly in the production of food and the production of life. Anyway, something might be worth looking at.
Thanks. Will, I think we could go on, but we'd probably need to move to the next speaker. So thank you very much, both of you, for very stimulating presentation. And I'm echoing myself. I hope it's not echoing.
And your name is echoing all over.
Oh dear. I seem to be turning into Sun Wukong with a Feng Fa. I'm not sure what's going on.
Or Agent Smith.
Okay, well, maybe I should not talk. I'll just let Chunjie go ahead. She's next.
There's
I
echo.
better stop talking.
What's wrong?
I think everybody has to mute themselves.
Very strong echo.
Yes, let me go ahead and mute myself.
Okay. Oh. Huh? Is everything all right? Okay, all right. My computer just wow. So do you all hear me and see me? You can also hear and see my screen. Okay, perfect. Very good. Okay. Hi, yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I think actually our discussion just is a perfect segue actually to my paper. And I'm also going to talk about a little bit of Confucian ethics, but first of all, I would talk about Max Weber and his concept of charisma, and to actually discuss actually how Max Weber, how the German sociologist has tried to incorporate new Confucianism or Neo-Confucianism into his thinking and to create a new notion or a alternative set of rationalism to better reflect a more balanced philosophy of life. So I think the purpose is very similar to Cruz and Jiaru's talk today. So among the very many well-known Weberian concepts, charisma is perhaps the most popular one. So maybe I should, yeah. So this is Max Weber's German sociologist, economist. Many of you might already know his name, so and his well-known work. So yeah. American social scientists and German emigre intellectuals after 1933 often invoked charisma in a negative manner to describe the irrational or demonic leadership of Hitler, Mussolini, or Stalin. These scholars observe fascist and communist movements as a kind of modern political religion, often without any explicit acknowledgement of Weber or his works. The sociologist Theodor Abel uses charisma to explain the strong and almost mythical and enigmatic attraction that National Socialism exerts over its followers, and he interprets Hitler as a charismatic prophet for the Germans. The emigre German sociologist Hans Gerd considers the Nazi Party an organization with inherent charismatic elements and Hitler as a charismatic leader based on his dismissal of experts and his administrative favoritism. Whereas during the 1930s and 1940s, the notion of charisma had been exclusively applied to European politics, starting in the mid-1950s, American scholars began to use charisma to characterize political leaders in Africa, Asia, and Latin America during the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, and nationalist movements. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Fidel Castro in Cuba, Mao Zedong in China, and Kemal Atatürk in Turkey were all referred to as being charismatic to explain their popular support. This seemingly positive turn in the application of charisma, however, is not unproblematic because after the end of the World War II, with the stronger tendency toward rationalization, charisma is still seen as something more primitive and irrational. Joshua Durman notices that the emigre political scientist Karl Löwenstein argues that charisma could merely be applied to pre-Cartesian West and in the 20th century to Asia and Africa, which are still in a stage of a prehistoric mythical and religious state. By the mid-1960s, charisma is almost exclusively used in the context of a political leadership in Asia and Africa among American social scientists. Durman comments, this kind of Orientalism, however, was never part of the concept of charisma as Weber originally intended it to be. Furthermore, the term charisma, despite its academic Orientalist connotation, has entered the American popular discourse in the 1960s. Ironically, Time magazine claimed charisma as, quote, one of the dominant cliches of the 60s, end of quote. American politicians are increasingly expected to have charismatic media presence as political potential to attract voters and execute policies. In the 21st century, the British historian Ian Kershaw's famous biography of Adolf Hitler once again deploys the term charisma to describe the Nazi politician. Tracing charisma's diverse usages and connotations in the 20th century, I question how this term is defined and for what purpose it is originally developed in Weber's writings. I consider it necessary to relocate the term within its intellectual historical context so that an adequate understanding of charisma may be achieved for constructive future usage. I have noticed that scholars almost exclusively refer to the posthumously published work Economy and Society, Wirtschaft und Gesellschaft in German original, published 1921, as the main source for the definition of charisma and its relationship to political leadership, Herrschaft. Few, however, have questioned the fragmentary and unfinished character of this work, and thus the context in which this notion has emerged in Weber's writing. Indeed, the title of the chapter, Charisma, is added by Mariana Weber, so Max Weber's wife, and her assistant, Mercio Pallier. After its publication, Economy and Society came to be considered one of the most important sociological works of the 20th century. Yet recently, scholars have seen discrepancies between Mariana's publication and Max's original intentions. Broadly speaking, Mariana included almost all of Max's unpublished papers and fragments and divided them rather randomly in 3 parts. She also gave the collection the general title Economy and Society and added many other subtitles to the fragments, including the title Charisma. Weber's papers, however, contain various unfinished projects that do not cohere as a single work. Many difficulties in the editing process arose because of the mistakes, inconsistencies, and arbitrary choices of Mercio Pallier. Publishers and readers, however, have believed for a long time that the major life's work of Max Weber is indeed titled Economy and Society. The editors of the most recent comprehensive collected works of Max Weber Gesamtausgabe, decided to treat Economy and Society as an aggregate and to single the unfinished writings to reflect more precisely and to signal the unfinished writings to reflect more precisely the historical appearance of Weber's papers. Among the published works, as I discovered, Weber defines and extensively uses the term charisma to describe Chinese emperor and Confucian literati in his treatise on Confucianism and Taoism, published in 1920. So here you see, this is the original publication cover, and here 1920, so the last work he published in his lifetime. In fact, the definition and the discussion of charisma in this work is more substantial than those in Economy and Society. The key features are not only discussed theoretically, but also historically with concrete examples from Chinese history. I thus argue that Weber substantially developed his concept of charisma in the context of Chinese intellectual history. Confucianism provides Weber the historical and theoretical impulses for the establishment of charisma in its full-blown content. In his famous speech, Politics as Vocation, Weber also invokes the term charisma and explicitly mentions traditional Chinese society as an example of a rational political leadership that recognizes the value of irrational human nature. Weber aims to strike a balance between rationalized political administration and its acknowledgement of tolerance toward irrational charismatic forces that have been with humanity since antiquity. Charisma is thus not a negative term for Weber. Rather, Weber is inspired by Chinese Confucianism and uses the term to envision a more balanced way of life. Indeed, Weber had already used the word charisma in his famous writing, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. I think I put it here, yeah. The German original, Die protestantische Ethik und der Geist des Kapitalismus, published in 1905, but he only used the term twice there. Peter Gosch, so one of Weber's biographers, observes that the Protestant ethics marks the first time Weber uses the words charisma and rational. But whereas rational and its adjuncts make up a major and explicit theme, charisma is apparently negligible, and this has justified scholars to set in citing it aside. There are just two usages, both of which relate to the pietist interest in doctrines emanating from Christ's apostles that are touched by their charisma. Despite the scarcity of the very lexical word, Gosch still argues for the importance of charisma in the Protestant ethic because many crucial ideas, such as the personal proof or grace associated with charisma in its later development, are already present here. Nonetheless, the concept of charisma received its first definition and intense discussion in Confucianism and Taoism. Here, once again, I put the table of contents here, and if you can see here, so the first part is, so Weber actually republished his Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism in this collected papers on the sociology of religion. And so the first part is that, the Protestant ethic. And then the second part is Confucianism and Taoism, Konfuzianismus und Taoismus. Yes, so in this, charisma received its first definition and intense discussion in Confucianism and Taoism, in which Weber explicitly gives a definition of charisma in the introduction. There is a good reason to take this definition of charisma as the most officially authorized version by Weber in his lifetime. In the introduction, Weber claims that he aims to understand the systems of life regulation, Lebensreglementierung, in 5 world religious ethics in a value-free manner, in ganz wertfreie Art, namely the Confucian, Hinduistic, Buddhist, Christian, and Islamic ethics. For Confucianism and Taoism, the Chinese spiritual world, Weber considers the concept of charisma crucial and thus defines it with 3 aspects. First, charisma is an extraordinary human quality. Außeralltäglich. Das geht nicht. Also, sorry. So I try to fix it, but my program doesn't allow me to type the German and the English at the same time. So anyway, so I'm just only going to talk about it. So charisma is an extraordinary, außeralltäglich human quality. A charismatic authority is an either more external or more internal ruling to which the ruled people submit themselves because of the belief in the quality of the certain person. Weber mentions that a magician, a prophet, a master of hunt, so Führer of Jagd und Beutetypen, a warrior, Kriegshäuptling, a so-called Caesarian ruler or a party leader represents such a charismatic ruler over their disciples, followers, troops, or parties. The legitimacy of charismatic ruling lies in the belief in and devotion to the extraordinary or larger-than-life quality of this person. Weber stresses that the origin of charisma is something that was considered supernatural in ancient human history, as registered in tales of divine revelation or heroic saga. For Weber, charisma, however, is not permanent because it needs to be proven true. Such a proof happens through wonder, victory, and other successes, most importantly, through the well-being of the ruled people. Once the success of wonder and magic disappears and the ruler seems to be abandoned by his gods, the charisma ceases and its authority vanishes. Weber maintains that the ruling under such charismatic leaders does not follow traditional or rational principles, but depends on concrete revelations and divine inspirations. It is thus explicitly irrational. In sum, this first aspect of charisma in Weber's definition shows it as an antithesis to rationality. Furthermore, it was above all personal, not impersonal. Weber defines the second aspect of charisma as revolutionary because of its independence from all previously existing norms. In this sense, charismatic ruling starkly differs from traditionalism, which Weber defines as the familiar, quotidian, and constant norm of action. Patriarchalism, Weber contends, is a typical form of traditionalistic ruling because it is founded on the authority of the father, husband, the oldest in a household or in a community, the master or the prince over their children, women, slaves, servants, or their subjects. Yet traditionalism is not less irrational than charismatism. Weber observes that patriarchy is contingent upon the acceptance of a set of unchanging or even divine principles, whose violation would entail magical or religious evil, as well as upon the arbitrary will and mercy of the ruler. It is thus irrational in that it follows personal decisions instead of an objective rule of law. While traditionalism manifests a belief in the divinity of the quotidian, charismatic ruling expresses a trust in the extraordinary. These two types of ruling, because of their shared irrationality, are not mutually exclusive. Rather, Weber understands them in a historical succession. For Weber, the third aspect of charismatic rule is the historical transformation from charisma to tradition, from magic to principle, from religious disciples to modern bureaucrats. Weber calls this historical transformation Veralltäglichung, a routinization or a process in which something becomes ordinary, quotidian, everyday-like, and mundane. In short, it is a process of traditionalization. Concretely speaking, those disciples, apostles, and followers on whom a charismatic ruler depends now have changed into priests, vassals, and most importantly, bureaucrats. In the economic sphere, a charismatically ruled community with gifts, alms, and the war booty has become a social group of people with salaried positions and granted rights who help legitimize the power of the authority to different administrative degrees. Weber maintains that this is a process of rationalization that originates from an irrational past and still contains the irrationality in its inner core. The birth of the nation-state and the establishment of the church in the West emerge essentially as products of such rationalizing process. These three defining elements construe the concept of charisma as an ancient historical phenomena that has transformed into the present. Weber comments that different foundations for legitimate regimes not only existed in the past, but also made their ways into the present in one way or another. Charisma is thus by no means an ahistorical category. Gosch comments that today's methodologists and sociologists operating in a partially dehistoricized environment, their idea of a concept is a static one. But Weber was one of the most sophisticated products of the most historically conscious generation in all European history, and vitally concerned with surmounting the problems posed by historicist relativism. The movement from purely irrational devotion to charismatic rule to economic interest is a rationalizing historical process. Yet Weber's understanding of traditionalism as irrational reveals the subdued charisma in the banality of economic operational routine in the West. At the same time, Weber sees a different path of charismatic development in China from the Occidental economization. It is a development from charisma toward ethics. In the main body of this treatise, Confucianism and Taoism, Weber observes that charisma in ancient China is also intimately tied to magic, like in the West. The charismatic person is someone endowed with the supernatural capability of debunking the evil spirits and thus protecting his followers. Since the power of heaven, quote, was also the highest benign leader of the social cosmos, then the Shen spirit in humans and in the world must be supported in their function. An emperor in China should be such a charismatic leader. Weber comments that the emperor is actually fully aware of his charismatic quality of his ruling, and he also consciously knows that he needs to behave in a certain manner to prove his extraordinary ability endowed by heaven. At the same time, Weber sees a historical transformation in personal charisma. When Confucianism was established as a pacifistic state philosophy and peace was restored after the warring state period in Chinese history, charisma became tradition. It is a tradition of morality that legitimizes the wars waged by the kings and justifies the subjugation of their enemies who have lost their charisma and violated the ancient convention. Weber argues, quote, the Chinese emperor is first a pontifex, transformed from the ancient rainmaker with magical religiosity to ethics. Since the ethically rationalized heaven protected a permanent order, it was ethical virtues of the monarch on which his charisma depended. End of quote. Like the Catholic Pope, Weber portrays the Chinese monarch as a bridge of communication between heaven and his people, thus a pontifex. The Confucian vision of heaven, at first sight a metaphysical category, is explicitly identified as rational by Weber, whereas he calls the rainmaker magical and thus irrational. The charismatic Chinese emperor has come a long way and transformed from a shaman, such as a rainmaker with supernatural spirituality, to a representative of an authoritative Confucian ethics. While the Confucian ethics is rational, it contains the irrational charismatic traits from his historical genealogy. The purported rationalization of ethics is indeed derived from something originally deeply irrational. The emperor is thus both rational and irrational. Charisma connects the rainmaker to the monarch, but it has changed from its overtly irrational quality of magic to an inherent but low-key trait of ethics. Despite historical changes, charisma remains a constant force. Weber also observes that charisma is also attached to a family or a clan in China. Quote, the positions of minister and even certain diplomat, as we find out, are held firmly in the hands of some families in the Chinese Middle Ages. Confucius was also aristocratic because he was descended from a family of nobility. The administration from the smallest size of xian to the larger provinces in China is also organized through the recognized and dominating charisma of the local officers and their advisory boards. After Weber describes the relationship between charisma and the positions of power in Chinese history, he turns to the highlight of his charismatic personality, the Confucian literati. Weber uses euphoric language to describe the charisma of this elite group of scholar gentry in imperial China. Their erudition in Confucian ethics is essential for Weber to portray them as highly respected carriers of supernatural charisma. Their extraordinary ability is manifested through their success in civil exams, as well as their expertise and writing skills in canonical, literary, and textual genres that are important in the documentation and communication of governmental affairs. The literati's charisma is also expressed through their harmonious style of administration without disturbing nature and humanity. All these abilities of literary writing and harmonious ruling are the proof of their charisma. Weber relates that both Confucius and Lao Tzu were officers before they became teachers and writers without an office. The intimate relationship between the Confucian scholar and state power, Weber comments, is essential to Confucianism, in which the political power becomes more and more centralized and embodied in the literati and their special métier of Confucian classics. The body politic is immediately related to Confucian ethics and scholarship. The emperor functions like an overseer of literati administration in a public sphere. If we look back at the negative usage of charisma to describe Hitler or Mussolini in the 20th century, we notice that Weber by no means would approve such a deployment of his Confucian concept of charisma. While the later social scientists primarily used charisma to make clear the irrational and demonic elements in the figure of a political leader, Weber in fact imagines a future vision of politician based on the model of Confucian scholar officials. The charisma of the literati is thus the result of a different historical genealogy that moves from magic to ethics. The West has sailed from magic to economization or capitalism and thus is not able to produce charismatic leaders. According to Weber, his call for the charismatic leader articulates his critique of capitalism and rationalization. A Weberian charismatic leader thus could not emerge in capitalist social conditions, let alone in fascism. Thank you very much.
So let's see if I'm still Let me, I'm going to go off, and hopefully when I come back, I won't be doing this. So if Xuanhua, if you could take over for a minute.
Yeah. What did you say to me? No, I said there was an echo there. But now it's fine. Well, but on my side, with each word I say, I get an echo. So what's wrong with Steve? It's in the waiting room.
Maybe his internet was not working well, so
Yeah, I think probably he lost the internet.
Yeah.
Well, probably we open it to questions.
Oh no,
Since Steve is not around.
I'm still getting an echo on my end. How about you guys?
Okay, now you're back. Steve, I give it back to you.
I'm back, but I'm still getting an echo.
Yeah.
Are you hearing it too?
Yeah, I'm hearing an echo. Maybe something wrong with the system itself. Or because we're trying to do multi-streaming. I don't know.
I don't hear an echo here, so.
You don't have an echo?
Yeah? I don't hear an echo, no.
Wow.
Yeah, you're not echoing for me, but Xuanhua is.
See, I got a message. Is it possible because of multiple people? Wow. Then Steve, probably you can mute everyone, and then whoever wants to speak and raise the hand, and then you unmute that person.
I think everyone is already muted from what I can see, so I'm not sure that's the issue.
Could you mute everyone, and then you unmute those who want to speak?
Let me see if I can do that.
There's the button, mute all. And then probably I can, whoever wants to speak and raise hand, then I can unmute him. Okay.
I think you have to do it. Okay, now it seems to be fine. Oh, no. There we are again. I'm not a host anymore, so I think you have to do it, Xuanhua.
Oh. Should I just take questions or whatever?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead?
Sure, yeah. Anyway, I mean, yeah, Kurt, I heard, I saw that you raised your hand, please.
I thought that was such a wonderful. I thought that was such a wonderful talk. You know, the ending to Protestant Reformation and the spirit of capitalism is the Iron Cage, and at the same time, Weber is the defender of a certain kind of rationalization, and it doesn't fit. You've provided the missing piece.
Right, thank you. I mean, yeah, I think there's quite a bit of misunderstanding actually also about his, understanding of capitalism, about his so-called uniqueness of the West as the producer of capitalism. Actually, by no means he is saying, look at our Westerners, look at our Europeans, we are able to produce capitalism. Rather, he was saying, how damn we produce capitalism. This is so strange and this is so terrible. We don't want to live like this. And, look at the ancient Chinese, look at the traditional Chinese. They produce a different social order, which is now has been destroyed by Western modernity. What a pity. We should actually restore a more balanced way of life and learn a lot from other people. So I think that he was saying this, and in a very sophisticated way, in a neo-Confucian way. So I think, yeah, so I kind of want to write the book right now to resurrect a lot of Weber's thinking and also Confucianism to a certain extent. Any other questions or comments or whatever? Yes, Martin, please.
Yeah, that was brilliant. Wonderful. One thing that your gloss or Xungu on Weber reveals is the power and presence of cultural politics, right? Because you've shown us that Weber was saying, hey, we should be looking at China. And the historians have turned that around and made it sound like it's exactly the opposite. And that still obtains now. Almost everything that gets said about China is fraught with cultural politics. The second point I would make is that you are clearly looking forward to making better use of Weber's concepts in the future. And I think one thing that would help there is to ferret out his mistakes, which I think come from Hegel. So this notion of an all-powerful emperor, or the idea that Tianming actually refers to heaven. These are big mistakes that are very common in the West. As you know from the ZHANG chapter, Tianming doesn't have anything to do with a god up there. You know, Mencius identifies it with the people, and A.C. Graham saw that very clearly. But I won't go into detail there. But yeah, I think a little bit of textual criticism could help to focus Weber's really useful ideas. Anyway, what you gave us was wonderful.
Oh, thank you very much. So I'm gonna email you in private so that you can tell me more about the literatures you mentioned. Thank you very much, Martin. Any other comments or ideas? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next talk.
Thank you. Yes. Okay, I am still echoing, but hopefully our next speaker won't be in this situation. So let's turn. Again, thank you, Chunjie, very much. Nan, if you could take over, I'll try to be quiet. And hopefully, you won't have this problem.
Am I echoing?
I have asked Chris to fix the echoing. Probably he's doing it now, and I do not hear your echo. So
okay, great.
Probably is improving. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I think if everyone unmutes themselves or mutes themselves, it should work. All right. Sorry, I'm going to set the timer. Okay. Yeah, thanks everyone for inviting me to this talk. I'll just go ahead and get started. So the question that I'm asking is, how has the Chinese theory and praxis of tragedy, or how can it become central to the understanding and critique of liberal democracy? That's the point of this talk, and it is the epistemic grounding for the larger book from which it draws. So I'll start actually a little bit of ways away from China and Chinese tragedy. Consider the rightfully secure position that Greek tragedy has enjoyed in the development of literary criticism and political theory from Coleridge to Nietzsche to the present. A bid for recentering literary forms in the public sphere, Richard Ubben's The Tragedy of Political Theory reminds of a time when tragedy was a robust political institution that opened public life to debate, discussion, and criticism, while helping to qualify citizens to participate intelligently in them. Greek tragedy evokes a citizenry constantly called upon to adjudicate juridical outcomes and their discrepancies from sound and humane judgment, a citizenry that takes tragedy in stride. But of course, the pedagogical force of Greek tragedy has derived in large part from its distillation of an irony. If tragedy is a thorough understanding of cause and effect and the consequences implicit in action, it must accept a distortion of its roles in the democratic societies that house them. I want to foreground two readings of democratic tragedies, two quick examples of its paradoxes drawn from Greek tragedy. The first is Kevin Chua's pictorialist reading of the aporia of democracy in Jacques-Louis David's 1798 painting, The Lictors Bring to Brutus the Body of His Sons. Chua looks at the figure of Lucius Junius Brutus, who, after helping to overthrow the Tarquins, become the co-counsel of the First Republic of Rome, and who, in response to the plot of his two sons to restore the Tarquinian monarchy, stepped outside of democratic protocol to order their execution. And here's the aporia. In order to secure democracy, a tyrannical exception has to be made. The second reading is Richard Lattimore and Martha Nussbaum's insight, distilled from their separate works on Greek tragedy, and specifically the Aristeia, that retributive anger and retributive justice in the form of Furies who pursue Orestes must accept their own neutralization in democratic systems. Why are you in a rage, they ask, of those tormented by the consequences of pursuing causality too closely? You are in a rage because you are sad, and you are sad because nothing short of divine intervention can stop the cycle of revenge and mutual recrimination. But you are also sad because divine intervention will make everyone forget why there was a cycle of revenge and mutual recrimination in the first place. Athena intervenes by turning the Furies into a democratic, juridical, and governing body. They no longer torment, but they also no longer really care to get down to the bottom of who did what and why. This is because, quote, and I'm quoting Nussbaum, retributive anger is indeed a poison to democratic institutions, and never more dangerous than when inspired by a feeling of helplessness. Greek tragedy-inspired political theory names a real predicament for diasporic subjects. Democratic liberal societies ask its constituents to think about some tragedies and not others, and really only understands multi-ethnic constituency insofar as each one prioritizes identity as political constituency. This constituency may be more ideologically flexible than what the diasporic subject remembers, but when it makes mistakes of judgment and errors of evaluation, the consequences can be far more severe, at least to the immigrant, because they know better or differently. As immigrants, the Chinese diaspora faces obstacles to self-expression and flourishing in liberal democratic societies that are not only lingual, economic, or cultural, but also moral and civic in nature. Liberal democratic societies, which have an entirely different political economy of discernment, can shelter their worst uglinesses from public view, which is not nothing, but it cannot quite hold their hurts or their warnings. So though the Chinese diaspora's interactions with foreign democratic liberal systems can be quite felicitous, that is, conducive to great happiness and not just bourgeois contentment, the latter are in many ways constitutively blind to their sensibilities and grievances. Like the insistence that some things should be left ambiguous, liberal democratic societies finds those with a strong etiological drive rather embarrassing. It cannot surveil closely enough to see those violences and injustices that happen all the time, and senses that only a totalitarian state could surveil this closely. So the system works by bypassing moral discernment and not encouraging it. Tragedy means thinking about the consequences implicit in action, what really gets overlooked, and how we might rectify it, and how poorly this knowledge fares in the path of migration from non-democratic to democratic systems. As in Greek tragedy, the Chinese diaspora testifies to the intense situational ironies caused by the absence of justice over time, the waste of meaning and human significance that spans countries, generations, and histories, and the intimate tyrannies that come from and engender state tyrannies. I'm looking at, and this is really quite new, so I'll look forward to what you guys have to say. I'm looking at Qian Zhongshu's last work of literary criticism, an extraordinary work and an extraordinarily tragic work, to pose these questions for Chinese tragedy. What are its contours, sensibilities, and analytical advantages? How might these migrate into Western literary theory and criticism? And not just topically, but in ways that, like Greek tragedy, fundamentally perturb the project of democratic liberalism and is fundamentally perturbed by it. I propose that Chinese tragedy, which Qian Zhongshu sanity checks with a thicket of similar instances in the West, in Western literary and philosophical and historiographic sources, that this tragedy limns the plight of moral disambiguation in the modern world and makes a rather obvious but difficult to accept suggestion for the burden of the rectification of wrongs. Qian Zhongshu was a famous Chinese transnational critic known for centering the crisis of unreliability in the Chinese literary and philological tradition, and for parsing the strange motivational structures of those who wonder about the miscarriage of justice as an extenuation of the problem of literary representation. That literature, and by literature I mean wenzi wenxue, that literature was susceptible to a simultaneous under-noticing and over-prosecution, occupied Qian Zhongshu from his Marginalia on the Margins of Life, which he wrote in the 1940s, to his last and bitterest reflections about contemporary life. And this last work of literary criticism, called the Guanzhui Pian, literally the pipe owl essay, collection of pipe owl essays, is translated as Limited Views in this virtuoso translation by Ronald Egan. The title is taken from Zhuangzi's The Floods of Autumn, Zhuangzi Qiu Shui, and the line 是指用管魁天，用锥指地也，不以小乎。So if you only use a pipe to look at the sky and an owl to plumb the depth of the earth, you're essentially kind of doing something ridiculous from the original source text. So while Qian Zhongshu seems like he's just kind of mobilizing a typical literati coyness about one's epistemic authority, this title is actually the apotheosis of the literary critic's mandate to pursue through nuance a lost cause, to plumb the depths and concealments of Tian and Di through small instruments that necessarily limits one's views and necessarily involve insurmountable labor. This book is largely an exercise in relentless moral disambiguation through textual explanation. Okay, so all of these essays largely work by saying, you thought this text meant X, but in fact it means Y. He uses the power of literary scholarship and explanation to explain morality, which just means to understand how malevolence and benevolence actually works in this world, and how to distinguish truth from deception when the truth is itself without human or cosmic support, because it is empirically indistinguishable from falseness. For Qian Zhongshu in this work, disambiguation doesn't just refer to the sorting of counterfeit from the real, or how benevolence and malevolence both make use of alibis to hide itself. It also describes literature and Wenzi's frustrating handling of empirically slippery things, such as the calamities that befell Zuo Qiuming and Sun Zi and Sima Qian, such as removal from office and physical mutilation. Poetry, Wen, is unreliable, not only because words and expressions are inherently unreliable and vulnerable to willful and unintentional misinterpretation, not only because there must be room for discrepancies between word and deed, the conducts of poets and his poetry, not only because fidelity to nature cannot be pursued too closely, although Qian Zhongshu also consternates over this, right? So the lines from the Songzi, from the Book of Songs that mention a green bamboo delicately waving along the Qi River runs up against the problem that bamboo does not grow along the Qi River. And Milton, he writes, describes falling autumnal leaves in the woods of Vallombrosa and Paradise Lost, but no such deciduous trees exist there. I don't need to belabor the point. This Guandrapian limited views is a work of skepticism. That is, it is a compendium of such inevitable ambivalences and ambiguities. And yet there's one ambiguity that Qian Zhongshu really can't let go. The more complicated structures that disincentivize people to set the record straight, even when there's no longer any danger of doing so. A collective slackness, if you will, in the pursuit of cause and effect. He's saying, yes, some things are indeed ambiguous, but largely people leave things at the wrong level of ambiguity. In limited views, written during the bitterest years of the Cultural Revolution and its unsatisfactory aftermath, Qian Zhongshu is essentially asking a question that haunted him. What if the author says it never happened, but perhaps it, and I'm quoting from the book, but perhaps it actually did? Or if it says it, if he says it did happen and maybe it did not. End quote. What if the crimes against humanity in question is one that even the victims don't care to tell because they happen serially through corruption, by others licensed by ideology or policy and its oversight to do to you what they had always wanted to do to you. And because in a very real sense, you have no one to blame for this but yourself. This is an unreliability that's worse than untrustworthiness. And it's not unlike Wayne Booth's consternation over unreliability in his 1961 book, Rhetoric of Fiction. The unreliable narrator is not just the untrustworthy narrator who manipulates his reader's interests. It is also the good-intending, the well-intending narrator who undermines a story's potential for delivering its own truths by fostering a readership less discerning than the story itself stipulates. In limited views, Qian Zhongshu is deeply worried about the fact that lurid cruelty has very few writerly friends, if any. He meditates over the fact that, that Sima Qian had been incarcerated and subject to corporal punishment and yet remains frustratingly reticent, or at least imaginatively withholding in his account of Zhou Bo's imprisonment in records of the grand historian. Sima Qian, he thinks, could have drawn on his own experiences, and yet in none of these instances did he draw upon his own experience to embellish the passage with any lurid details. And so the thing that happens to you when you're at the whim of another, licensed to do to you whatever he wishes, must be deduced. This omission of that which we ought to be able to deduce constitutes a real tragedy. Nobody wants to hear about this kind of stuff, except perhaps the wrong kind of people, those who would rubberneck at a lurid mutilation. And so the historian omits it, and thus introduces an unreliability worse than untrustworthiness. Tragedy comes again and again from these competing historiographies and philosophies of history and limited views. I'll skip ahead a little in the interest of time. Qian Zhongshu goes over various realizations that there is no final tribunal that would hear your pitiful account and make reparations. In this sense, the perennial problem of translating heaven between Chinese and other languages, is it Tian, is it God, is it ghosts, is it demons or paradise or the world itself? All of these problems of translation kind of melts away because Tian is whatever or whoever is last responsible, the last pervious thing along a sequence of impervious or undiscerning authorities. And yet corruptibility doesn't even stop at the level of the heavens. Qian Zhongshu discusses the Ming literatist Chen Zilong's essay explaining heaven, which argues that heaven possesses power but is unable to use it. That even the heavens suffer from constitutional weakness. he writes that the people amidst their peril look up to heaven, which is undiscerning. This is from the Book of Songs. And that the king's mind was confused and like heaven, undiscerning. This is from Mao Shizhuan from 3rd century BC. Both give credence to the idea that literary criticism, like Thomas Reimer's 1678 definition of poetic justice, is the only thing that can keep tabs on things that no one else can see or would care to track. You're sort of entirely on your own. And you needn't even bend over backwards in theology to learn why, to see that the authoritative bodies that are cosmic are in fact not all-seeing or just, right? He writes, the historians assert that if a ruler's virtue is paltry and scant, the ghosts and demons descend to observe him closely. But of course, if the demon must descend to observe the ruler's wickedness, then it is not all seeing and all hearing after all. In this cumulative assessment, you can't rely on authoritative bodies because they too are corruptible. But why? Let's take the example of ghosts or demons. Chen Zhongshu writes, although people are quick in their public declarations to extol ghosts and demons as all seeing, all hearing, and just, in private, they harbor the suspicion that this must not be true. And so it seems that those beings rush to the aid of powerful and mighty mortals. I'm still quoting Chen Zhongshu here. Ancient Romans observed that when two armies meet in battle, the gods favor the mightier, and that the gods are pleased by the victors, meaning that the gods aid the strong rather than coming to the rescue of the weak, and that the reader of the Zuo commentary, the Zuo Zhuan, is liable to obtain much the same impression. Comparison confirms that gods are corruptible, not only in that they accept sacrifice and dole out calamity indiscriminately, but that they are empirical creatures. They must look at things to know, and therefore cannot know recessive suffering before its presentation. They like actions that can be represented and narrated, whether it's victory or suffering, calamity or pleasure. They migrate, as we do, to satisfaction, to things that are guoyin, right? They abandon a large set of helpless things who are helpless for the same reason we abandon a large set of helpless things. It is just too damn hard and frustrating to intervene, and the payoff is too diffuse. Frustration deters the rectification of non-obvious suffering for mortals and non-mortals alike in this book. So even if it is a self-contradiction, Chen says, the contradiction on the topic of divine justice is a final one. You hold out for divine justice because no other possibility is really acceptable. And so of Sima Qian, he writes, although he did not believe in the way of heaven, he did accept the notion of hidden accumulations of virtue to be rewarded by heaven and divine retribution to be doled out by hell. Perceiving heaven to be distant and unknowable, he still felt that within its dark obscurity, there must be a controlling intelligence, end quote. This is no cruel optimism. It is instead a Stoic's conviction and therapeutic reasoning, which is always going to shift one's view to find a way of seeing a device, a design, unfurling through time until it sees the reparative function. Reparative meaning to fix things, to make things right, to do whatever it will take to, quote, suffice to relieve the people's distress and agitation. And the Stoic, the Confucian Stoic, which sort of emerges from limited views, is the person who finds that he has to resort to that therapeutic reasoning to make things right, and who unbudgingly blame themselves for the wrongness of things because they blame themselves for backing down in the face of a monumental distortion. And they openly consternate over the fact that someone somewhere physically pays for the moment of writerly cowing in the face of expressive difficulty. And so I'll wrap up by saying that I think it's this sort of interesting deductive or maybe even inductive view of Stoicism, who is sort of the way of thinking about the wrongs in the world and what can and cannot be presented before a tribunal that is whose responsibility at last falls on like yourself, right? That may be a real counterweight to or even just a kind of partner in the way that tragedy can interact with democratic liberalism, which it is sort of like fundamentally anathema to. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Dan. That was quite a tour. So we will open it up to questions. Zhongqie.
Yeah, I think it is an excellent talk, very theoretically sophisticated, and you find out a lot of issues from the Chen Zhongshu book, and you try to tease out the border significance. And I think Chen Zhongshu tends to disagree because he is such an erudite, incredibly erudite person. He knows such a lot, both the Western and Chinese tradition. So consequently, he can always find something extraordinary about, say, anything, any text. And then he usually does the kind of 翻案文章 to show you, actually, it is not what presumed to be true. And what make him different from other scholars is he could produce all those evidence and all those. And even his work style is very, unconventional. He's not known for any coherent construction of a system, but rather it's like a collection, a huge collection of notes, whom even with the modern internet, you may not be able to search and find and put them in a sensible order. But one suggestion for your paper, I wouldn't say this is the work he'd written, the last work. This is not a book he set out to write. It's more like a collection of many notes he made in his lifetime. And he was fortunate somehow he managed to, to keep those many of those notes. So it is a combination of notes. Then he wrote a kind of a coherent critical essay more in the 40s and in the earlier times. He didn't produce a lot of monographic books or even essays. Just but that 5 volumes, the 管锥篇 is really a milestone. I heard in 73 or 4, he was a delegation sent out by China to tour the US. Then he gave a talk, and he switched from one language to another, and yet could just give citation off his head, on top of his head, and everybody really, left everywhere flabbergasted, about his knowledge. But I think probably when he writes about particular texts like a tragedy and like Sima Qian, that he probably is trying to say a lot of things about his life, about contemporary work, about his attitude, even during that time, about the politics. But in many other glosses, and I don't think that he's trying consciously doing that. So I would not try to not to overstate. It's not like an entire book is written, conceived with the kind of political agenda at the back of his mind. I really do not believe so. Yeah, it's more like some topic that really resonate with his own life and thing. Well, that's it is a great topic, and it's a great paper, and thank you, for your contribution.
Do you want to respond?
Yeah, just very quickly. Yeah, no, I think it's monumental. I mean, my goal, I think, is to, have limited views be a kind of reference point in the way that mimesis is, or Victor Shklovsky's writings are, or minimum morality. I mean, I really think it's of that order. Yeah, I think you're right that that it's a compilation. But I also think that he takes pains to establish unreliability, from like permissible unreliability that scholars and people, pedants can sort out small unreliabilities all the way to existential unreliability. And I think that's not, I mean, I don't know if that's a political, I don't even know what it would mean to say that that's a political project, but it has to have to do with, there's a kind of internal coherence to the pedagogy of the book. It's not just an essay here, an essay there. It does move, it does sort of like intensify the consequences of stopping at the wrong level of ambiguity, I think. So that's all I'll say.
I think the ambiguity also has to do with his personality, because he's so, you put it in a negative way, but he's extremely, arrogant, but not in outward, but inward. He really believed, and he did know, more than any other people know, about the scholar, about history. It's incredible. It's a genius, a genius of that kind. As a junior, really, you cannot live with, a lot of other people's views, and then he will always find fault, and he would produce evidence to support his. What can you do? Yeah. So there's that, personality issue, that kind of the intense desire, well, insuppressible desire to prove he's right, you're wrong. And then what can you do?
That's my point, though, is that he is trying to prove that he is right and you're wrong, and that moreover, it matters, right? It matters. It's not just, oh, your opinion, mine, your interpretation, mine. It matters because it matters to the project of reparation. You have to figure out what is the right version to have any chance at fixing non-obvious injustices and suffering, right? And that the Stoic, this is the Stoics' way of eating crow. Like, it might just be his personality, but you've absorbed the entire set of responsibilities, and so it's like this. You have to be intelligent. You have to bear it, because that's your best chance.
That's very difficult for him, and we were all Stoic living during that time. We have no choice, but it's particularly hard for him. Mm-hmm. For someone, the more you know, then the more miserable you are, and then the burden of history, burden of life is harder. It's really remarkable to have lived that long. And
yeah, so this is a really funny part where he thinks that the worst thing that can happen to you is that you're in hell, and then that there's no transition. You're just sort of like walking along, and then the rest of it is just hell, So yeah, I think he felt it, but I think he also, it's not, yeah, but we can leave it there. I think it's monumental.
Okay, I shouldn't say more. Okay, I'm so sorry. Okay.
No, it's fine.
Other questions or comments for Nan?
And also the title of Wei Cheng, right, is extremely reflecting about him, the paradox of life. So those besieged city, those who are in want to get out, and those who are out want to get in.
Right, but that's almost like an elementary paradox, whereas like Guanzhipian is a that, like, the Wei Chen the Wei Chen paradox is one that you can basically explain to a middle schooler, but the paradox of corruptibility, of what it would take to address the injustices that's caused by real moral weakness, is not that's why I think, like, as a child you only heard about Wei Chen, right? And so I mean, as a literary scholar, it's actually quite easy to become dismissive of Chen Zhongshu, and in fact, he's at the same level, if not, exceeds his contemporaries in Western literary theory. So, yeah.
So that really brings up a question, and how can we make Western scholars read Chinese texts in the way we read the Western text, and find out the paradigm, and we find out the kind of strategies and to adapt. No one give any attention. You know, I mean the people outside our field. So this is our failure, reflection of our failure, and why can't our scholarship produce something and that have a kind of a way of setting a trend, setting a new way of thinking. Yeah, yeah. But definitely the breadth of knowledge is really unprecedented.
Well, I don't know if it's our failure. It's the
Well,
failure.
no, Qian Zhongshu would say like it is actually like it is our fault. Like you like you are actually responsible. So no,
well, not in a moral.
so
I mean, just simply in his reception.
yeah.
We can't.
No, I mean, I think that
take
Ronald Aiken
responsibility
did
for that.
such an incredible job. There's no way that I could have read the original and have, you know, I really needed the translation, and the translation is pretty phenomenal. And so we'll get there, you know, it'll just take some time.
You know, rather than Wei Chang, I actually really like his short stories too. And I think, you know, there's a consistency to his worldview that really comes through even in his earliest work. Maybe it is, you know, obviously it's not the erudite work of Guan Zhuipian, but it's I think a preview of it in there's a short collection of 4 kind of novellas that I would recommend very highly if you want to delve more into his fiction. He wrote it, I think, after Wei Chang, just at the very end of the Civil War.
Yes, I would. I might have read some of them, but I would love the recommendation. So yeah, do send them over.
Yeah, sure. Well, if no more questions, let's move on. Thank you very much, Anne. So Minghui is next. Minghui Hu of UC Santa Cruz. Where was China? Geodesy in the early modern world. So Minghui, I think you're here, right?
Yeah, I'm right here.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Steve and Chunjie for inviting me to share my work here. So let me share my screen and we can start. So I'd like to bring everybody back to 18th century China. Let us begin with the text. The text is called 西域文件录, stated in 1777. That was a moment when the Qing Empire almost completed its expansion. So the logic of any kind of pre-modern or early modern empires in terms of their territorial expansion would be conditioned, of course, by its military might and its resources. So by this time, it was at its peak, at its largest territory around the 1780s. And of course, the Qing Empire was also about to exhaust all its resources for further expansion. And this text was written by Qi Si. He was a Manchu bannerman with a courtesy named Zhuang Yuan. So he passed the metropolitan examination and became a Jinsi in 1754. That was the year, and a very momentous year, for all the major scholar officials to pass the exam and leap into the intellectual stage of 18th century China, such as Ji Yun, Qian Daxin, Dai Zhen, all these people. Dai Zhen did not pass the exam, but he was there at that time and met his people. So, and Qi was one of them. He was a Manchu Bannerman, but he also passed the exam and became a cohort of this very important scholars. But unlike them, Qi did not continue to set the intellectual agenda of his time. He sank into oblivion and was known only for this book he wrote, the Xu Wenjianlu. So to explain why this text came into being and to situate this text in terms of the cycle of the Qing imperial history, I like to make some analytical distinction here. So I would like to separate the Qing monarchy from the Confucian bureaucracy, and also emphasize there was a huge military establishment, of course. That seems to be quite self-evident because that's how Qing Empire expanded so far into Central Asia. But recent historical scholarship had paid a lot of attention to the Manchu and the Mongol sources. And therefore unearthed a lot of materials and institutions, especially the banner institution in the Qing monarchy. And I would also like to view, and this is also done by a lot of Japanese scholarship, to view Qing monarchy as a coalition of multi-ethnic aristocracy, actually. And therefore, Qing monarchy had a very different kind of agenda from the Confucian bureaucracy. If we can further complicate these issues, you can see that thanks to Kengai scholarship, that by the middle of the 18th century, Qing already developed this very mature systems of provincial governors who were territorial officials who were simultaneously part of the Confucian bureaucracy and military officials. And it is at this level, very high level, the level of the territorial officials, provincial governors, and the Grand Council and Six Boards, that's when you have this exchange or share of the knowledge between the military establishment and the Confucian bureaucracy. Other than this high level, the Qing military systems and the Confucian bureaucracy were relatively separate. Okay, so Qi as a person, a Manchu Bannerman, who were somewhat familiar with the military side, but he also passed the civil service examination and was very well versed in the system of the Confucian bureaucracy. That's what I'm trying to say here is also Qi was the guy who actually could tell you a few things from both sides of this organizational chart. All right, let's now look at the text. Look at the preface, Xu. I want to read the first sentence, 地在天之中，但玩儿. So the translation is pretty straightforward. The Earth locates at the center of the celestial spheres, and its size resembles a pinball in the cosmos. So what he really means was this. It was a taconic cosmos, and that's what Tian meant in the 18th century. And this was not controversial at all. After Yang Guangxian was defeated during Kangxi's time in the 1660s, this taconic cosmos, the Tian, had been instituted in the Qing systems, and it had been used until 1911. So in this sense, when Qi was saying, 地在天之中，但玩儿, he was not saying something controversial at all. He was talking about this official version of how the cosmos works. A second sentence is more interesting. He say, 中原在地之中，一鱼饵. The central plain, and usually that is the code for China, right? The central plain is located on the spherical Earth's surface, and it looks like a corner of the Earth. What he meant by this sentence was this. So this is from the text 地球著作, more or less contemporaneous with Qix's text. So this is the Earth, and Zhongyuan was right here. It was indeed a corner of this pinball, right? And there's the flip side of this Earth, the D. And now let's look at a different part of, oh, by the way, let me mention one more thing. So this Earth part of the, so you have a Tian on the one hand and D on the other hand. Tian was rather uncontroversial. Tian was very clear. It was official and most people had to accept it. But D, on the other hand, the D as presented here was very controversial among Confucian scholars. It was, most scholars found it very difficult to accept this idea with a spherical Earth and with this kind of geopolitical arrangements. So this was more controversial in the 1770s. So with the 10 and D, now let's look at different parts of the same page of the preface. So it's a Huang Sang Shen Shen Wen, blah, 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 blah. It's a pretty, the 3 lines text, and I translated here. The Huang Sang, of course, refers to the Qianlong Emperor. The Qianlong Emperor is magnificent and sacred. His Majesty's cultural achievement and military might are outstanding and transcend all previous dynasties. He conquered 10,000 li of Western territory. The dangerous faraway field and stubborn land is now part of our territory. Those who speak ignorant words and wear clothes all kneeled and touched their foreheads on the ground, showing their submissions to His Majesty's authority. This, of course, has some sort of a little bit Orientalism, a little bit of eulogy of the empire, of the emperor. But what he really meant was this. It was, this is Castiglione's paintings, a very famous Jesuit court painter. And he was showing the Qianlong Emperor in the field during the campaigns to wipe out the Zheng guards. And he was not dressing with his court gowns. He was dressing as a regular Han sort of official there. But here you see this, 2 Muslim Turks submitting the white horse to the emperor, and they are indeed showing the submissions. So this was the visual representation of Qing's military might and their conquest of Central Asia. And by the end of the Xu, the date, 1777, and he signs his name here, Zhuangyuan Qixi. Okay, so this text was, well, the Qixi himself, we know very little about Qixi, this person, but this text was enormously popular. We know this because it was printed and reprinted so many times, and we also find about 7 versions of this text. So that shows that people really love reading this, probably because Qixi's literary qualities too. This book is really well written and very fun to read. So, what was the message? So Qixi, number one, Qixi took for granted the entire Qing official version of the Jesuit cosmography and geodesy. And he described the newly conquered land called the Western regions. I would argue these 2 points, 2 important messages, were equally important and closely related to each other. So the past scholarship really did not make these important connections, and how the Qing monarchy continue to have this consistent idea of both Tian and Di, heaven and earth, or the celestial spheres and the spherical earth, moving forward as they continue their empire building activities. Now, I would say that the Qing geopolitical knowledge that went hand in hand with its territorial expansion, basically throughout the entire 18th century, something had transformed from 1700 to 1770s. Because the Chinese territory, well, the Qing Empire's territory doubled around this time. And how do we make sense of that? Well, Qixi himself, he was a fairly insignificant political actor, but from his position and perspective, he shared a lot of the geopolitical knowledge of the Qing monarchy. And the Qing monarchy, because of the pragmatic demands, deployed the Jesuit geodesy and geodetic surveys and cartographical representation to serve as the premises of the Qing geopolitical political knowledge. So here I highlighted the military need and hydraulic engineering. There were 2 fronts, right? So for the military expansions into the Central Asia, military need was the fundamental ones, because it had to do with the logistics of how Qing Empire would calculate the actual distance in order to plan the logistics. In terms of China proper, it was a lot to do with the hydraulic engineering and known as Hegong or Caoyun, which was essential to the Qing Empire to govern China at that time, because they need to make sure that the Yellow River was controlled and the Grand Canal was also kept clean and moving, so they could transport the grain from the south to the north. So these 2 major functions of the empire were all required a very careful measure of their landscape. And that's how the geopolitical knowledge and was valued very highly throughout most of the High Qing China. So now, let's go back to this organizational chart again. Because the maps, the surveys, all this knowledge were had to do with the military logistics and planning, and it was fundamentally used as an intelligent tool. And it was also kept very confidential because it was only for military use. So this part, it was basically made and controlled and distributed in this part of the Qing state apparatus, which means it was a military operation. The geodetic surveys was a military operation, and it was controlled and reported directly to the Qing monarchy. And most of the Confucian bureaucracy and scholars have very little idea of what's going on with these maps. In fact, they have probably never seen the maps. And that's also my point here. The Kangxi Atlas, the most famous map, was not discovered, or according to a lot of historians and Confucian scholars' point of view, it was not known to them until 20th century. It was discovered to them in the 20th century. And that also includes a lot of our world maps to them. But of course, there was not really a discovery. It was just because they were kept in the military channels and not so much in the Confucian bureaucracy. So I'm going to stop sharing now. Let me see if I can and say something about this specific maps and their surveys and the technical part of it. Fortunately, we have, let me see, hold on. We have a website, actually. Let me share my screen again. That gave us all the maps we can that was done in the Qing dynasty, and this, of course, is based in the Qing Maps project, done by a team from Leiden and University of Macau. So there were 3 consecutive maps made throughout the entire 18th century. The first one is Kangxi 1721's map. If you look at this one, the map basically, well, Kangxi basically surveyed most of the Manchuria and the China proper. And Yongzheng's map in 1728 was based on the Kangxi's map and adding this part, mostly from the Gansu and the south of the Gobi Desert. And finally, after Qianlong Emperor launched his campaign to conquer the entire Central Asia, he made a new map, and he actually sent out a new team to survey Central Asia and complete the rest of the map in 1770. So you can see this, by this time, the map basically include most of the Central Asia here. So this map have a very strong characteristics of the scale. The most important part of these Qing maps were their accurate scales. And these scales were projection on a 2-dimensional space from a 3-dimensional, which is a spherical, well, basically it was a Earth planet. It was a pinball, right? A pinball, according to Qix's metaphor. So with the 3-dimensional space and now project to a 2-dimensional representation to provide the accurate scale for pragmatic use of the Qing dynasty. So there's already a lot of scholarship on the maps themselves. But what I'm arguing here is that to make these maps, the Qing monarchy actually need a consistent, coherent cosmology and geodesy to do so. And it was not random, or it was not just hiring Jesuits to use them to do these things. It was consistent and it was systematic, and now we know enormous amount of both the literature from the Jesuit side and the Chinese side or even the Manchu language, Manchu sources side, that it was very systematic, and it was a lot of knowledge were translated, and that kind of a cumulative systematic aspect of this kind of geopolitical understanding of the entire landscape and how the Qing Empire was situated in this globe, in this entire world, was very clear to the Qing monarchy, but it was not so much so for the Confucian bureaucracy. So that is the fundamental difference there, and that is how it was passed down to the rest of the Qing dynasty. So final point is that because of these separations of the geopolitical knowledge on the military side, and not so much on the Confucian bureaucracy side, many scholars were trying to learn from the Qing monarchy about these maps, cartographical knowledge of the Qing Empire. And they then got a different kind of idea, and they go back to the ancient texts and trying to combine them together. And now that entire portion of scholarship was then known as Dilixue throughout most of the Qing dynasty. So I'm trying to make fundamentally 2 points. Number one is that Qing monarchy was the driver of this kind of import of the import of geodesy was fundamentally driven by the Qing monarchy. And it was kept quite separately from most of the Confucian elites throughout the 17th century. So I'm going to stop here now.
Thank you, Minghui. What a fascinating topic. Those are wonderful maps, aren't they? So, brief moment for questions. Is that your hand raised, Songqi, or is that from the previous session? We don't know. Well, let me just say, I have actually read Wenjian Xu Wenjian Lu, and it did strike me, yes, both, as you said, the lively style of it, and just the level of detail that he gives of this region that was relatively unfamiliar to most, and the contrast with the Han officials who wrote about their experiences there. I mean, they really are two completely different experiences of the region by depending on really the ethnicity of the official. Because there were a lot of other Manchu and also Mongol officials who wrote about their experiences being posted, and they were generally posted for much longer periods of time too in Xinjiang, I believe, than the Han were. So thank you for telling us more about that.
Yeah, well, and also, Xiyu was a newly invented term in the second half of the 18th century. It was, I just went through the entire 500 pages of the Zhang Dada's new book on Modern Great Wall. So he detailed the entire border defense of the Ming Dynasty for about 300 years. Throughout the entire Ming Dynasty, there was no reference to Central Asia as Xiyu, right? And before Ming, the Mongol Empire, of course, would never name the Central Asia as Xiyu, because to them that was not west of their territory. And before the Mongols, northern China was dominated by Khitans and Jurchens. They would never call that Central Asia, call that part of the world Xiyu. So, and the Song Dynasty basically had, and then before that, it was Song Dynasty, they had no language to describe that at all. So for the Qing scholars, they need to search for a way of talking about that part of the world, Central Asia. And of course, we know in the 19th century, it was then called Xinjiang. But by the end of 18th century, they were searching for a name for Central Asia. And they were debating, they have to go all the way back to the Tang Dynasty and Han Dynasties, right? So they were debating to call it Tufan, which is the Tang Dynasty's term, or Xiyu. And they settled on Xiyu, and there's a huge debate on why they should call it Xiyu instead of a Tufan. So Xiyu was the newly fashioned term in the 18th century. And ever since then, Xiyu became a standard term for literati, and that was the name that invokes all kinds of baggage, imaginations from the ancient times. So that part of the combination of the very practical geopolitical knowledge with that kind of literary fascination from ancient China sort of emerged into the second half of the 18th century.
Okay, probably time is really, we need to move on.
Yes, let's go ahead.
Quick question for your consideration. Then how about the 玄奘是大唐西域记? So that is the title of this book, 大唐西域记. So that already, yeah.
Yeah, yes, I know, but that was okay. I have a lot to say about that, but I'm not going to, let's not get into detail for the time's sake here.
Well, I think you just answered that actually when you mentioned that it was a deliberate choice of an archaic term from the Tang, and really even more from the Han, as far as I remember. Yeah. Well, great. Well, let's move on then. So Jason Wirth of Seattle University is going to tell us about Gary Snyder, Kenneth Rexroth, and other worthy sages of the bamboo grove. So welcome, Jason.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be among such esteemed scholars and thoughtful people. Special thanks to Steve and to Zhongqi. Thank you very much for your invitation. I think everyone here probably knows even better than me that the worthy sages of the bamboo grove, those were these legendary Taoists, maybe a little bit anarchist, but they were definitely part of this legendary image of the counterculture. And so that image is kind of floating in the background of my comments. And my own comments also, I think, it's not a paper on Yogacara, but I think it will resonate a little bit with the Yogacara paper earlier. It has similar ambitions. I begin with the opening line of Dufu's Spring View in Gary Snyder's translation. The nation is ruined, but mountains and rivers remain. To speak of Kenneth Rexroth's and Gary Snyder's respective receptions of select aspects of classical Chinese poetry, one must first consider what they inherited and into what context they deployed it. What aspects of Chinese poetry did they find appealing, and for what reasons? In this respect, even before differentiating Rexroth from Snyder, one should be clear that neither American poet sought to glorify the Chinese state or to reinforce Chinese geopolitical prestige, nor did they attempt to use Chinese poetry to extol the value and power of American culture. Rexroth and Snyder were subversives who in part recognized something subversive in both Chinese and American contexts about certain classical Chinese poets. They were drawn to what they perceived as the Chinese counterculture as contributing to the newly emerging American counterculture. And what, broadly construed, was the pith of this subversion? James Brown has felicitously characterized it as the Zen of anarchy, quoting Brown, immediate inner revolution aided by Buddhist practice directed towards anarchist models of social behavior, end quote. Although this most aptly describes Snyder's practice, it is not incompatible with Rexroth's sensibility. Importantly, Brown rightly stresses that this was not an Orientalist fantasy in which one imagines some distant Shangri-La. It was a thoroughgoing Zen critique of Western ideology by exponents like D.T. Suzuki that inspired this generation. This was not Zen as an escapist refuge in the absolute, but as clarifying the mind and opening the heart in both personal and social transformation. Anarchy, a word now so misused and misunderstood that it is almost worthless, does not in this context denote chaos or randomness. Rexroth was the founder of the San Francisco Anarchist Circle in the 1940s. And Ferlinghetti, you all know him, he recently died a few months ago, recalled him selling Italian anarchist newspapers at his city lights. Rexroth considered himself a philosophical anarchist. That is, he refused to cede authority to the state and its structures of hierarchical domination that comprised what he called the social lie, but he would not resort to violence to overthrow them. He was therefore also a pacifist and conscientious objector, and even worked to smuggle Japanese Americans out of the incarceration camps during the Second World War. Snyder, like Rexroth and many others, understood that bioregional ecologies were essentially anarchic, that is, highly organized and interactive, but without a centralized and dominating authority. We can further clarify the issue by distinguishing pacifist philosophical anarchy from individual anarchy. The latter holds that individuals should be free from government restraints so they can pursue their own ends. The problem is that those ends can include individual appropriation on a massive scale, as atomistic agents are free to extract whatever resources they want and to put the land completely at their disposal. This is closer to the libertarian strain found in some places in the United States West, but it has nothing to do with philosophical collective anarchy. In fact, many ecological activists are hesitant about dismantling centralized authority for fear that capitalist extraction will run amok and that there will be no one to regulate the ongoing rapacity of both corporations and like-minded individuals. So Rexroth and Snyder's position is deeper. Philosophical or collective anarchy, on the other hand, is quite clear about the link between the state and global capitalism, and that it is madness to dismantle the former and consequently further liberate the latter. Unlike individual anarchism, which permits the consumption of whatever one can lay one's hands on, philosophical anarchism, like the workings of an ecology, affirms that the commons belongs to all, human and non-human, and that we are all beneficiaries of the commons, and therefore we all have a mutual responsibility to maintain it for everyone, human and non-human, sentient and non-sentient. Governance is decentralized, labor is no longer in the service of the enrichment of a few, the hyper-concentration of capital is dismantled, and responsibility is distributed widely within a locality. Rather than central structures and individual concentrations of hyperwealth where a few dominate the many, responsibility is complex, broadly shared, and evolving. As importantly, this turn to Zen and some aspects of classical Chinese poetry was not consequently a case of reverse Orientalism or self-imposed Occidentalism. Snyder and company creatively transformed Zen to address an unfolding global economic and ecological crisis. Zen practice, as well as some aspects of Chinese classical poetry, were allies in an already emerging counterculture and resistance. Snyder, having studied Zen in the Rinzai tradition in Japan for a decade, understood that its Buddhist institutions, even those of Rinzai, could be co-opted on behalf of the state or other forms of the power elite and pitted against personal and social liberation. As Snyder wrote shortly after completing his time in Kyoto, in Earth Household, so that's 69, so a year after he returns, I quote, "The truth in Buddhism, or even in Hinduism, is not dependent in any sense on Indian or Chinese culture. That India and China as societies are as burdensome as any others. It became clear that Hinduism and Buddhism as social institutions had long been accomplices of the state in burdening and binding people rather than serving to liberate them, just like all the other great religions. In general, both Rexroth and Snyder discovered in some classical Chinese poetry not only a rejection of the madness of the day and the dust of the marketplace, the human mind bereft of practices of awakening, the famous Buddhist locution, but also an awakening to our ensconcement in the natural world. As Elliot Weinberger observes, I quote, "Among the things in Chinese poetry that directly appealed to Rexroth and Gary Snyder, and later David Hinton, was its celebration of wilderness, something that had been neglected by Pound and Whaley, Lowell and Viner. Many Chinese poets, whether in exile or in Taoist or Buddhist retreat, had inhabited landscapes as dramatic and wild as those of the American West, and the poems they wrote had no equivalent in world literature where nature tended to be domesticated or fearsome. Snyder has written how his work in the national forests informed his early studies of Chinese poetry. Both he and Rexroth, because of their extensive wilderness experience and a Buddhist training in place to place it in context, were able to see the natural specifics of Chinese poetry in a way that more desk-bound translators were not, or so says Weinberger. Rexroth, for his part, found that the writings of the German mystic Jakob Böhme testified to the power and sacredness of the natural world. He discovered a compatible sensibility in the poetry of the Tang Dynasty poet Du Fu. And in both accounts, this was not the natural world as a pleasant recreation or a pleasing environment, but rather, as Rexroth's biographer Linda Hamalian reports, I quote, "the sanctity of nature within an explicitly social and moral context," end quote. The wild was not an escape from politics, but rather the ground of and personal and social transformation of politics. As Rexroth himself wrote of Du Fu, who was, and I quote, "far from being a philosophical poet in the ordinary sense, yet no Chinese poetry embodies more fully the Chinese sense of the unbreakable wholeness of reality. The quality is the quantity. The value is the fact. The metaphor, the symbols are not conclusions drawn from the images. They are the images themselves in concrete relationship. It is this immediacy of utterance that has made Chinese poetry in translation so popular with modern Western poets. The complicated historical and literary references and echoes disappear, probably not a good thing in my opinion, and the vocal effects cannot be transmitted. But what nonetheless comes through, stripped of all accessories, is the simple glory of the facts. The naked, transfigured, poetic situation," end quote. Indeed, one could increasingly characterize Rexroth's own poetry, as well as his poetic versions of Chinese poetry, as a kind of meeting, both philosophically and in terms of their formal structure, of Böhme and Du Fu. I mean, you have to say that. I mean, what other poet has said, the project for world consciousness is Burma and Dufu in dialogue? But that was Rexroth. The result would be global wilderness in its anarchic ecological dimension. Moreover, the proximity of Dufu and others to his own work is both the strength and the weakness of Rexroth's translations. This affinity allowed Rexroth to emphasize some invaluable insights of these poets into the natural world as a deep spiritual practice and ethical awakening and responsibility. It also blurred the line between his own poetry and what he was translating. And despite later collaborations with Lingnan, it certainly did not help that Rexroth understood Little Chinese. A sinologist would no doubt be rankled by his techniques, and although there is much beauty and value in his translations and, or really better, versions, as Weinberger contends, and I quote, "More than any other translator of Chinese, it is almost impossible to separate Rexroth's translations from his own poetry. They tend to speak as one," end quote. Rexroth, the force behind the legendary 6-gallery poetry reading on Friday, October 7th, 1955, that launched the San Francisco Renaissance, and during which Snyder read his A Berry Feast poem. So this is how Snyder and Rexroth come to know each other. But unlike Rexroth, Snyder would go on to undertake 3 years of graduate studies at UC Berkeley in Chinese and Japanese, and then spend 10 years in regular Zen training in Kyoto. Snyder's most influential and celebrated translation, begun already as a graduate student, I'm sure everyone knows this, is of Hanshan, the Buddhist recluse and Zen symbol of both awakening and resistance to the status quo. In fact, Snyder and others, including Burton Watson, helped make Hanshan or Cold Mountain better known in the West than in China. Snyder reports that the Chinese, perplexed by the popularity in the West of a poet who is not in their canon, sometimes refer to Snyder himself as the American Hanshan. However, Hanshan and his broom-bearing sidekick, Shide, are much better appreciated where Snyder himself studied him in Japan, where they're known as Kanzan and Jitoku. They are featured in countless Zen paintings over the centuries, where they respectively embody Manjushri and Samantabhadra, wisdom and compassionate action. Recently, 2016, Snyder complemented this by publishing a subtle series of reflections called The Great Clod, which I know you all recognize as Zhuangzi's name for the Great Earth, in which Snyder collects over 4 decades of brisk reflections on Chinese natural and political history. So his big confrontation and defense of his Hanshan sensibility. In a recent personal correspondence with Snyder, Snyder assessed his relationship to Rexroth with regards to their mutual embrace of some classical Chinese poetry. So here's Snyder himself answering my question directly. What do you think of Rexroth? Snyder. Rexroth was a unique sort of guy and a full-fledged egomaniac. You can pick that up by reading his various poetical and political essays. He did not really know much about the Chinese written language, and even less about the spoken. In his own time, when he had no competitors, he was one of the few who knew anything at all, however, and he had some very good insights from time to time. You find them in his essays on Chinese poetries and in his versions of Chinese poems. Once I had started Chinese courses at UC Berkeley with Dr. Ed Schaefer and Dr. Peter Budberg, I realized what it would really take to get into that poetry. I never taxed Kenneth with his shortcomings, however, and continued to see and talk with him until he got into some terrible messes with wives and other women, and then I was returning to Japan. He quit talking to me when I became the director of the California Arts Program under Jerry Brown. He really hated Jerry. That's Snyder. Snyder also regarded these poets as a testament to his own resistance and hopes for ecological awakening and social transformation. Snyder. Zen and Chinese poetry demonstrate that a truly creative person is more truly sane. I aspire to and admire a sanity from which one has spare energy to go on to even more challenging, which is to say, more spiritual, more deeply physical things. It is worth re-emphasizing that Snyder's China was its counterculture, its resistance to its own imperial ambitions. What Snyder holds for China's remarkable Shuanshui or mountains and waters painting scrolls also holds for his favored poets like Han Shan and Du Fu. Unlike Shuanshui poetry, Shuanshui painting for Snyder were latecomers, I quote. Paintings of large vistas did not appear until around the 10th century. This was after 2.5 millennia of self-aware civilization. They are at their most vigorous from the mid-Song through Yuan and early Ming, exactly when most of China was becoming deforested. So rather than exemplifying some deeply and widely held cultural practice and congratulating itself, for Snyder, one should read these things as themselves already testaments to something that is on the verge of disappearing altogether. When Snyder was in Kyoto training in the Rinzai lineage of Zen, he was given the Dharma name Chofu, listen to the wind, or he might even say to have the mind of the wind. He was further counseled not to be afraid to have this mind. But what is it to listen to the wind? And I'm coming to my conclusion. A clue could be found in the Japanese philosopher Watsuji Tetsuro's profound retrieval of a term of the Japanese read as fudo, comprised of 2 kanji, fu, wind, but wind, a poetic way of connoting the inexpressible, as well as customs and cultural practices, and then do, land. The term itself has been variously translated in English as climate or milieu, but I think we should just add that to our philosophical toolkit. But Fudo allowed Watsuji to retrieve a pre-modern or pre-scientific sense of the Taoist and Mahayana Shizen, which had been in contemporary parlance demoted to a translation for the Japanese of the word nature in the sense of natural sciences. But Shizen was originally the Japanese reading of the Chinese term so important for Taoist practice, ziran, so of its own, to be like itself, spontaneity. It is attuned to the place-specific self-occurring regimes of mutual emergence, much as we now understand them within the dynamics of bioregional ecology. Fudo names the rootedness of cultural life into the bioregions that give rise to and support it. To listen to the wind is to attune oneself to the manners of interdependent life that a specific land can sustain. I think he'd also probably say this also about the whole configuration around Tiandi. Snyder was in effect charged with listening to and abiding by his time and place, to learn to re-inhabit, in Peter Berg's famous phrase, his specific ecology, and to reconcile human etiquette with what emerges ecologically of itself. In other words, he was called to a practice of the wild, the latter being a variation of many ancient words, but one of them we could say is ziran, a practice of ziran. Listen to the wind, practice it, even in your translation. Although the science of ecology is necessary, it is not sufficient for a practice of the wild. It It needs to be reconciled with new versions of ancient wisdom and compassion practices. This, in the broadest sense possible, is the pith of what has come to be called deep ecology, what Bill Duvall and George Sessions loosely describe as the task of extending the interrelations that comprise a bioregion as discerned in the science of ecology to include non-scientific questions like what manners of habitation, politics, and economics are best suited to a particular bioregion. For Snyder, the New World Order ruinously imposes itself on the land, listens only to itself. This has been a disaster for indigenous peoples, and it has demoted for Snyder, despite the surfeit of material wealth, is demoted the spiritual quality of life for the entire world. It has even more pointedly been an utter catastrophe for the non-human animals and other forms of life with which we interdependently share our ecologies. Never have dominant and dominating forms of our species so widely celebrated themselves while degrading and destroying the ecologies that sustain them. The New World Disorder is a suicidal social contract. It belongs to the task of our time to confront the disease at its root, and it is precisely in this light that Snyder turned to poets like Han Shan. Translation, and Snyder is quite explicit about this, and this is my last sentences, is also a fruit of listening to the wind. Now, Snyder, unlike Rexroth, you can say this. He took the scholarly elements of translation seriously. So it should also be correct, and you should be able to say that by being grounded in the language that you're translating. Knowledge of classical Chinese is a necessary condition. For Snyder, however, it is not a sufficient condition. I quote Snyder, "The translator who wishes to enter the creative territory must also make an intellectual and imaginative jump into the mind and world of that poet. No dictionary will make this easier." One has to listen to the wind also. This, for Snyder, was enabled by his own sojourns into the mountains, his own travel into the backcountry, both of civilization and his own mind. It was in such mountains, in the classical sense, that he met the Buddhist and Taoist elders. You know, Snyder has his own version of Lin Chi's famous Your Original Face Before Your Grandparents Were Born. And he says, this is the work of the translator. Find your original mind before you entered language. That's where you meet the Chinese. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jason, for that wonderful talk. So we're getting pretty far along into the evening here in Asia. And I don't want to take up any more time. So let's have a Q&A. And then my talk is actually a very good segue from yours, Jason's, but I've recorded it and I'm going to put it up at the end of this recording of our session. So if you're curious and want to listen to it, it should be up tomorrow. So I'll cover some of the ground that Jason did and a little bit of some related topics, but I don't want to take up any more time. But let's just go to questions. It's so wonderful that you have been able to work with Gary Snyder, I think, all these years, and producing your own work on his poetry and his philosophical ruminations. I'd just like to hear a little bit more about that experience of yours working with this giant of West Coast and particularly San Francisco and California literature. what that experience has been like.
Yeah, he's a kind man. Yeah, it's interesting that one of the reasons why Americans read Han Shan and the Chinese know of Han Shan but may not read him, it's because of Dharma Bums by Jack Kerouac. It's crazy, really, on one level. That's just a crazy thing. And Snyder himself thinks it's all crazy. He thinks fame is crazy. He thinks being a famous person is crazy. He thinks how you live is an extremely important aspect of how you think. That includes your scholarship, that includes translation, that includes not only what you know in terms of doing something that's correct, but how deep you can go. How deeply can you meet the poets? And that can't be something you do only when you're translating. It has to be how you live. And so Snyder himself, I think this is quite striking, has always lived the way he's written, which is right on the margin. So where he lives is on the margin between civilization and the wilderness, in neither one nor the other, but in that very liminal space where the two meet. And he likes to comment also that to really understand what the mountains were for the Chinese, that means it's the place where you can no longer cultivate rice. As steep as the mountains be, the Chinese are very good at terracing their rice paddies. But where even the Chinese can't find a way, that's where it begins. And so we're called to live really on that margin, in that in-between space. That in-between space is a space, say, for example, between the academy and what is outside the academy, between the protocols of correctness and depth and scholarship, all of which he extols and regards as absolutely fundamental and necessary, but insufficient. You also have to bring the wind, your own practice. You have to be sensitive to what the value of these issues are for this time, and to be able to see that, say, for example, in Du Fu, of course, he's speaking to his time. And of course, we can say very right things about that and very wrong things about that, and there'd be some yes or no answers. But that in itself is not sufficient to really say, well, why is Du Fu so important right now as we're on the precipice of self-extinction? You know, where do we meet Du Fu? Where do we meet anybody? How do we live? And so I think it's in that very liminal space that he's been a really interesting person to have as an interlocutor for myself, who has begrudgingly, perhaps because of the force of circumstances, taken a more purely academic life. But I'm also a Soto Zen priest. So that's my own practice of the wild that I allow to complicate my academic life, to be able to give it its depth. I think the academic life, 100% left to its default mode, squanders a treasure. I'll be diplomatic about it. But he's been good on that, really pushing. So what you want from a teacher, if you say something incorrect, he will tell you that's incorrect. If you say something is merely correct, he will tell you to go back to work. That's all you got. And I think, to me, that's very deep about what it is to be in dialogue with China. And so really, we have to think very deeply about the space of the encounter.
Thank you so much. Jaru.
Hi, Jason. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. And I am an eco-critic. I work within the field of eco-criticism. And now the bioregionalism within my field, it's a cliche now. And the dominant trend nowadays, everybody is talking, is the Anthropocene, where the idea that the physical contact, you know, the importance of the intimacy with the land is no longer valued, because now the ecological crisis has changed. You know, the human being has transformed the earth, right? And lots of the eco crisis is not visible. So I just wonder, how would biooriginalists like Gary Snyder respond to this type of and also the shift, and Kurt was just talking about, from a deep ecology to new materialism. And what would be, because this is sort of our project too, right? You know, how do we revive deep ecology? Really deeply damaged. Sort of, it's done, it's finished nowadays by new and also within, it's so sad within Chinese with Chinese eco-critics too in my field. Now they all turn to a new material, which is very powerful because we have to address the problem of the Anthropocene. So I was just wondering, what's your take on this?
Thank you for that question. It's an excellent question. I could speak about it all night long. I have some very passionate thoughts about it, but I'll just put a few things down on the table. One, I think a hard, narrow definition of deep ecology was never really what deep ecology was about to begin with. And so I think the arguments against deep ecology are straw man arguments, honestly. And I think that the opposition between a turn to the Anthropocene, really, I mean, deep ecology is probably, in its broadest sense, already aware that long before the word Anthropocene even came along. And I'd also say this: the concentration on the Anthropocene risks blurring a very important distinction. Who is anthropos? Now, I'm with Stephen Malm, who says that it's the second worst mistake you can make in the climate emergency, the first being just to deny the ecological crisis altogether. So like politicians in my country, by and large. So that's the worst, and they're the worst, and my country's the worst. But we have competitors. But the second worst mistake you can make is to say this is the problem of what it is to be human as such. That anthropos really is a collective, all-inclusive, single definable thing. Well, there's a huge difference between someone reading Han Shan in the backcountry and the CEO of Exxon Oil. There is a huge difference between the 1% and its reliance upon many injustices, including the burning of fossil fuels as their fundamental business model, given also that we know that since the 1970s, corporations like Exxon knew better than any other scientist exactly what the externality of their own business model was, and spent millions of dollars distorting it and making Americans and others stupid about it. I mean, it's big news even in recent weeks. You know, they just caught another person online bragging about how they're going to utterly decimate Biden's ecological agenda because they have so many allies in Congress. This is crazy. And I think the Anthropocene, yeah, I take it very seriously. It's a very powerful heuristic. But the Buddhist in me wants to see the whole elephant. And each blind person sees what they can see of the elephant, and each one has its insight. Each one is able to draw out another part of the problem. And deep ecology, which I would simply say this, it's simply the question. What do we start with first? What do we listen to first? Do we listen to capitalism and say, hello, capitalism, solve your own inner contradictions for us? Or do we listen to something in the backcountry of any economic system and try to say, well, you know, how should we live based on the conditions that sustain life? And not just our life. So I think also, you know, really a good ecology is not so anthropocentric. And the Anthropocene, which is constantly starting with the problem of anthropos, really takes away deep resources in which, in the backcountry of our own thinking, deeper than the agendas and ideologies that hold sway and the academic fads that make us all come to the same conclusion, which already should be immediately disturbing to us. You know, we lose some deep sense of coming from a deeper place. Where do we meet the elders? The same place you meet coyote and eagle, wolf and bison. It's the same place. And the resources are legion. They're all over the world. They're ancient and contemporary, but they require some resistance. But that's just a short down payment. I have lots of thoughts about it, and I like it all, but I don't like the part in which we imagine. The word I hate in new materialism is the word new. I hate that. I hate the fad of the day. The materialist tradition has always had tremendous resources, and from any generous disposition, you can draw on those. I notice that the best of the new materialists will draw on people like Dogen. Well, I don't think Dogen's new. I believe last time I checked, he lived in the early 13th century, or first half of the 13th century.
Thank you.
Any other questions? So thank you all for, excuse me, persevering through to this very last presentation of the workshop of my own. I'm going to make this brief, partly because we're all anxious to get to the discussion, I'm sure, and maybe even a drink afterwards, but also because my paper is still largely a work in progress. Excuse me. I had planned this work as an ethnographic study based on local fieldwork, which, of course, the pandemic has prevented me from undertaking. So in this outline, I will limit myself to discussing the conceptual framework and methodology that I'll be using, an overview of the topic, and my tentative hypotheses. Now, I've identified this as an ethnographic study, but it's both somewhat more and also somewhat less than our conventional understanding of the term. I will, of course, gather information through the typical methods of fieldwork and interviews, but my inspiration for the project is a lyrical one. For my model, I look to the 9th century in China, not to Hanshan as Gary Snyder and his forebears in Japan, Korea, and China itself did, but to Liu Yuxi, the great essayist and poet of the Mid-Tang. Among his multiple highly acclaimed works are 11 poems he called Zhujitsi, or bamboo branch lyrics. As he described them in a colophon, they were inspired by the rustic songs of the local residents of the Three Gorges region of Sichuan, the Sanxia, to which he was exiled in the early 810s. Liu reconfigured them as 7-character quatrains, with which he attempted to convey the fengtu, the character of this region, both human and biological, but also hydrological, geological, and topographical. This is one of my favorites, and like most great poetry, it seamlessly combines both Qing and Jing, and lyricizes the difficult lives of those who live and travel along the turbulent waters of the mid-Yangtze River, as well as more general insights into human relations that this scene evokes. Over the next 1,000 years, in fact till the 20th century, Zhujitsi evolved into a medium for writing lyrically about specific localities all across China, and even beyond its borders. And it achieved the heights of such melding of empirically derived information and lyrical affect in the Qing dynasty. In this respect, it arguably anticipated the so-called effective turn of social science that has gained momentum over the past couple of decades. Anthropologists and sociologists in particular have argued for experimentation with poetic forms that can be faithful to experience, yet convey an equally true but artful reality. This positioning of the ethnographer not as a dispassionate social scientist, but
as a poetic craftsperson, brings her or him to adopt a performative stance that enacts and reenacts refrains, as Guattari would put it, that pose alternatives to sterile and potentially hierarchical, or perhaps Orientalist, modes of writing. So in this ethnography, I adopt the stance of Liu Yixi and his successors in my attempt to convey the emotional complexity and nuance of the two communities I have chosen as my subjects, which is a loaded word in this context. I don't plan to write actual poetry. I don't have the literary gifts for that, but rather to write lyrically, as the sociologist Andrew Abbott enjoins us to do, such that we can directly confront the chasm between ethnographer and subject to convey an affective resonance with fengtu, as I believe Liu Yixi so effectively modeled in the 9th century. And through this, I will attempt to convey the discursive processes by which two central figures in the dissemination of Chinese culture in the West, Alan Watts and Xuanhua Shangren, fashioned and were in turn fashioned by the regional specificities of their physical environments. So let me start with the two scenes in both a literal and a figurative sense, or physical spaces really, in which Watts and Xuanhua were situated. Druid Heights was an artist's colony in the hills near Muir Woods, just north of the Golden Gate. As you can see, it's a group of very humble buildings constructed in the 1950s to the early 1970s by a couple of architects and builders with a strong affinity for Japanese architecture and an idiosyncratic love of uncomfortable spaces, at least compared to today's McMansions that dot this area. This is where Alan Watts spent much of the last decade of his life, eventually moving there permanently in 1970, and where memorable poetry gatherings and readings with Gary Snyder and others took place. Druid Heights reached the heights of its significance as a site of cultural contact and transmission during these years when it served as Watts's headquarters. Moreover, it was during the last 3 or 4 years of his life when, hiding out by the rock outcrop that he called Cloud Hidden, when he fully realized and fleshed out his lifelong fascination with Taoism, which resulted in the posthumous volume Tao in the Watercourse Way. So Druid Heights quickly fell into disrepair after Watts' death and the death of Elsa Gidlow, its owner, a few years later. And it has lived on as an historical site under the ownership and care, or more accurately, the neglect of the U.S. Park Service. But to trace the thread of the Buddhist and Taoist synthesis so eloquently, if not always accurately, explicated by Watts, we turn to the second chapter of the story. It picks up in the years immediately following Watts' death, when the venerable master Xuanhua and his foundation purchased the site now called the City of 10,000 Buddhas, located about 150 kilometers north of San Francisco. As you can see here, nothing here screams simplicity or counterculture. To the contrary, this institution has reproduced the grand architecture of a Chinese Buddhist temple, its pailo, at least in its entrance or facade. In fact, however, the sprawling complex still looks very much like it did when it was constructed as a mental hospital, which was closed in the early 1970s under the administration of the former Jesuit novice and sometime Buddhist monk, Governor Jerry Brown. Now, in virtually every imaginable way, Xuanhua and Watts seem like polar opposites. Watts was given to extramarital affairs, heavy drinking, experimentation with psychedelics. By the way, that's Timothy Leary on the left, good friend. And immersion in the bohemian milieu of artists, poets, feminists, and other nonconformists who frequently gathered at Druid Heights. And here, not only is Gary Snyder, but his good friend, I'm having a senior moment here, but anyway. Xuanhua presided over a vigorously disciplined monastic setting where his enthusiastic disciples, both Chinese American, but also non-Chinese, practiced in intense month-long or even longer sessions when they sat for 16 or more hours per day. And he encouraged 4 of them to undertake the so-called 3 steps, 1 prostration pilgrimage for peace that made them famous across the US and even across the world. What indeed can be said about these 2 charismatic figures, other than that they shared a passion for the way, Buddhist, Taoist, or perhaps simply Chinese, and their respective proximity between the latitudes 38 and 39 degrees north in the California North Coast Range. In essence, the aim of this paper is not to demonstrate irreducible or direct affinities per se, let alone genealogical links between them, even though to a certain extent those did and still do exist. Rather, it's to explore the embodied affinities that these respective communities established and fashioned or refashioned across the landforms that nurtured them, and to both compare and contrast their relationship to the land across the roughly 50-year time span that I covered in this paper. Here specifically, I will turn back to the example of Geodesy, a genre which, it can be argued, is not for the most part about bamboo at all. It's instead a poetry of water, in which watery environs are invoked constantly, whether as rivers, canals, submerged rice fields, dikes, lakes, etc. They typically dwell in the ways in which communities utilized and depended on water and other natural resources for transport, for food, indeed for their very survival. The ubiquity of oarsmen, boat pullers, pilots, lotus-picking maidens, and fisherfolk in the poems attest to both his fascination with and the insights that dependence on such natural processes and resources entail. It is precisely this close attunement to water that invite comparison between Watts's and Xuanhua's writings and many talks. As Watts grew increasingly identified with and rooted to Druid Heights in his final years, his writings turned to the metaphorical powers attributed to water in the ZHANG and other similar texts with increasing frequency. In the early 1970s, he took up Taiji Chuan with the master Huang and collaborated with the latter in multiple projects, including his final book, The Watercourse Way. For Watts, it seems that the properties of water assumed ever greater significance to him, both physically and spiritually, and even emotionally, as his writings attest. It seems hardly coincidental that Druid Heights was perched rather precariously in an environment of alternating abundance and scarcity of water. Its owner, Elsa Gilbo, and her fellow residents, Roger Salo and Ed Stiles, were able to retain year-round access to water supplies by carefully constructing an ingenious system of storage and pipes that diverted the local stream into their water tanks. But the system could not generate adequate supplies during drought years, which occurred disconcertingly regularly in this area. This exquisite but vulnerable balancing act is arguably enacted in Watts's final burst of creativity in the early 1970s, just as an epical drought was beginning to engulf Northern California, and especially Marin County. The entwinement of water and religious or cultural creativity is even more central to Xuanhua's establishment of the 10,000 Buddhist city in 1974. Xuanhua claimed in his talks about this era that it was the dearth of water in Ukiah that led first the state government and then its private buyers to close and then sell off the mental hospital to the Dharma Realm Foundation in 1974. Xuanhua presents the appearance of water as a kind of miraculous event, preordained karmically, and thus the fulfillment of his self-proclaimed destiny to establish a Western school of Buddhism. The area had no working wells, he said, until he took a staff with him and strolled around the grounds, and then suddenly drove his stick into one spot and told his followers to dig there. As the story goes, water gushed forth in abundance, assuring plentiful supplies for decades to come, regardless of the vagaries of meteorological conditions. The miraculous skills of Xuanhua continued into the mid to late 70s, when his followers relate tales of how he was able to call forth rain dragons, jiaolong, to quench the thirsty earth in Los Angeles on a visit there. Such natural cycles of adversity provide the requisite opportunities to buy property on the cheap and to demonstrate the sublime power of spiritual attainment gained through strenuous but joyful effort. Xuanhua achieved nirvana in 1995, and his lingering power over and connection to the environment continue to protect the prosperity and growth of the 10,000 Buddhist city to this day, say his followers. That is perhaps until now. California and the West's deepening drought require divine intervention more than ever before. Yet the Venerable Master's powers may have reached their limits against the 413 parts per million of CO2 that's ravaging North America, especially the northwestern part of the continent. In my interviews and fieldwork for this project, I plan to pursue questions of how the community is coping with this emergency, and how my informants may be seeking to ameliorate it through cultural and social, as well as practical means. In this process, I will attempt to draw out some of the implications and ramifications of this half-century-long process of the diffusion of Chinese culture as represented by these two institutions, individuals and communities. California has a long history of social and cultural experiments that ultimately founder and dry up on its unpredictable, if paradisal, landscapes. Of course, in our own time, it is much more than a single community or even region, but all of humanity itself that is at risk of withering and disappearing into the newly desiccated earth. Thank you.
Questions? Well, that was a wonderful conclusion to our time together. And I'm really proud that I was able to collect so many interesting people for this event, Zongqi and I, such wonderful scholars and thinkers, and really an eclectic but interestingly cross-sectional series of talks that I think will come together in a great volume once we bring them all together. So I'm hoping that you'll all continue and submit your pieces when you're ready, and we'll be sending more information about that as we move into the post-pandemic era. And hopefully, in fact, we're planning on it to see all of you in Beijing. And that may not be in 2021, but we're hoping for 2022 anyway. So thank you all for this wonderful event of the last 2 days. Xuanhua, do you want to say anything else?
I think nothing to add. And thank everyone again, for joining us in this adventure. And probably we'll get back to you concerning the paper. We still need to think hard on how to put the paper together as a Korean volume. Is always a challenge for editing and sometimes you have to part with good papers that do not really fit into the scheme, and then probably try to find home elsewhere. So this would be some of the hard decisions we have to grapple with. But each paper really has a lot of barriers, and it's a good papers. But we really need to think about that, because it is a part of Professor Yuan's projects. That's the dissemination of Chinese culture. So we have to bear that in mind. So these are the things probably we need to talk and discuss. Yeah. And of course, feel free to send each other comments. I think one of the main purpose of holding the symposium, even in the virtual space, is to get feedback from the audience. And I wish we had more time and we can assign a commentator for each paper, so that at least you get one person to read your paper thoroughly from beginning to end. And then, so, but I think since we have to accommodate many papers in our sessions, and there's only limited time our physical body can deal with, and I want to thank Steve for really, running the marathon, presiding over the long meeting, including the one that really ended about 6:30 in the morning, the beginning at 11. So the marathon. I really had to quit in the middle of it, but Steve, made of steel.
Well, they don't know about this. Yes, we had another session last week.
Very kind. So I want to thank you again for leading the project.
Thanks. Thanks, Chunjie. So keep in touch, and I hope all of you are enjoying the summer wherever you are. And
we hope to meet face to face.
Yeah.
In 1 year's time.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed. Yeah.
Yeah. Keep our fingers crossed.
Thanks to you all.
Yes.
Thank you
both.
so much.
All of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. And stay in touch.
Bye.
Everybody.
Good night. Good night for me, anyway.
Good night.
Thank you.